K-12 schools, we're going to continue the conversations we've been having over the last year about how the current service level of funding is calculated. I have a large number in my budget that I think is more adequate and stable for our school districts. There'll be a bill to put some of that stuff in place so we can, those recalculation elements, so we're not continuing to have this conversation every 2 years. But I am moving from how much money and how it's calculated to the accountability piece. You heard about that in my speech. There's work the Department of Education can do right now administratively to streamline things. There's a lot of reporting, there's a lot of data collection. How can we make that make more sense and also reduce administrative burden for our school districts? But we also have to have a conversation, and this will be a statutory conversation, about when a district is failing, when the numbers are showing that they are not succeeding for their students. How do we require direct assistance to those districts? So I am currently working with a set of education stakeholders to work on that language, but that is something I want to see done in the legislative session, because we need more transparency, accountability. More money is just not enough. No system is fully funded.
Unknown participant is now joining.
No system is fully funded, but we need to make sure additional resources in K-12 actually produce stronger outcomes. So those are my 3 top priorities. No surprise, there's a lot going on. I am going to be sitting down with my team to learn about where the Wildfire Funding Advisory Group has landed on recommendations for sustainable ongoing funding for wildfire suppression, as well as money to help communities be more resilient in the face of wildfire. So that is a priority for me. The transportation package. This will be my 3rd transportation package as an elected leader in Oregon. I've been through 2, one when I was not speaker, one when I was speaker, and now as governor. We have to get a transportation package done. We're at the place where you usually are at this point in session. A lot of information has been gathered. Now we got to get down to brass tacks about how we're going to pay for it. I will be working with legislators to help them do that. So I look forward to see what they're going to come forward with. And one last thing that I think is really important for the session, I'm hearing a lot of interesting ideas around reducing costs for Oregonians, focusing on consumer protection, whether it's automobile loans or medical debt on your credit reports, all these types of things. I think Representative Sosa's committee is going to do some interesting work, so I'll be watching that. And then lastly, I would just say, I think it's important for all of us, because it's hard sometimes we get in this this little silo that's called the Capitol and the Oregon legislature, why we're here. We have people who are living outside. We have people who can't afford their homes. We have people who need mental health and addiction treatment. And our schools just have to do a better job for our kids. So I'm going to keep bringing it back to why we're here and try to keep the legislature focused on those top priorities, because I think they're essential. And no one disagrees that they're essential. So we need to stay the course, continue to build progress on what we've done, and make sure the investments of the budget match up with those goals. So I am happy to take some questions.
Governor, I have 2 questions, and I'll do them both. The first you probably expect. What did you learn from your previous legislative sessions as governor? And what will you do differently this time? And my second question is, you have, to the best of my knowledge, avoided saying what you would like in a transportation package, how to pay for it. What are your preferences in regard to that? Thank you.
Well, that's okay. We'll start transportation. But on the first question about what have I learned, in my first 2 sessions, the long session in 23 and in 24, I would just remind folks, I was very committed to spending a lot of time visiting with Oregonians around the state. So I was visiting all 36 counties in the first year, which didn't allow me to be as present. Last year happened after the session, but I spent a lot of time working with visits to the tribal nations. And of course, in a short session, it's a lot harder. My goal this session is to make more time to have personal conversations with legislators. They have very difficult jobs. And some of the highlights of my first year in office is when I invited all of the freshman legislators to my office for lunch. We did them in like large groups of 3 or 4. So we just did it in alphabetical order. And so we had a good mix of folks over lunch. And it was some of the most useful conversations because we need to know each other as people. And so as governor, one of the things I would like to do this session is just free up time in my calendar to have just more personal conversations with legislators about whatever they want to talk about. So we can build the relationships to get good stuff, hard stuff, easy stuff, all done by the end of the session. Transportation. So my budget's, I think, clear about the minimum we have to do. We have a big budget gap in the Department of Transportation. And that has, because it's accumulated over time at the end of this transportation package that we're currently under. I don't want to have to lay off a bunch of folks, and we need to maintain our roads. We need to keep them safe. That requires a high-functioning Department of Transportation, excuse me. And we're going to look at the things that we have normally looked at to fund transportation in the state. Gas taxes, fees, things that are related to what it means to drive on our roads to help fund the system. Here's what I will say. I've heard from some folks, and I'm going to name names, who have said, well, why can't we just use general fund for the transportation package? I can tell you that that's not feasible. Unless somebody wants to bring a bill that wants to take $2 billion out of general fund for transportation, that is $2 billion out of education. That is $2 billion out of mental health services. That's $2 billion out of housing. General fund will not fill this gap. There needs to be a transportation-related revenue conversation here. And I think we'll start seeing numbers here in the next 30 days because this is the point where I say, put some numbers out there, see what people can do. We know how to fund these things. We've done it in the past, and we need to do it again.
So can I follow up on that? You're making it sound like we're talking about registration fees and gas tax stuff. A lot of people are talking about a usage fee for roads, something relatively novel. You personally said tolls might still be on the table in the future. Are they firmly off the table? I mean, help us understand it, because it sounds like from your answer, you're just talking about the same old slate of fees and tax increases, but maybe there's room for more?
So we'll have to look at the usual sources. There's no way we can't. I am a supporter of user fees. I have been over the years a fan of what we have set up. I think it's Orgo here in the state where people can voluntarily say, instead of paying gas tax, I will track my usage. Remember, that all came about before we had all those insurance companies and everybody tracking our mileage, and it was very scary at the time. Now people are like, it's not a big deal. If I can show what I'm using, I'd rather pay that way. What I will say about that, even if we went to complete road user fees tomorrow, you need a ramp up for that. So what I'm hoping we'll see in the transportation package is that gets added to the funding mix. So over time, we can transition more away from a gas tax to a user fee. But that's a transition. So people have to be really honest about that's a good idea, but you're going to need traditional plus new to move us forward for the next package.
Okay. Can I ask another one, Julia? We talked about costs. I cannot have a discussion with a Republican in this building right now without it reverting to your PLA executive order and their contention that is a sign that Democrats are not serious about reining in costs, that is only going to add the cost of projects. I'm sure you're familiar with these arguments. You've been hammered in other corners for that, and I think this thing kind of caught some people off guard. I personally didn't know a ton about it until you signed that order, and now I've looked into it. Why was it necessary now? Where did you come up with 15%? It seems out of step with other PLA proposals I've seen, but maybe not all. I've never seen an FAQ with an executive order before, so that seems, a lot of this seems interesting to me, and it kind of came out of left field. Can you help me understand?
Absolutely. And we could, if I don't answer all your questions, we can have another conversation offline. So a couple things. No one should be surprised by my personal commitment to making sure when we have very large amounts of dollars going into public projects, that they have the benefit of not only getting a job well done, but also supporting the workers in the communities that are doing the work. Okay, so that should not come as no surprise. As Speaker, I supported a project labor agreement for the second round of the project here at the Capitol. I said, we must have a project labor agreement because I believe when the construction company sits down with workers prior to the beginning of a project and come to an agreement about how things are what are the terms and conditions of the workplace, that the job will be better done with higher skilled workforce, and in many cases, at cost or less, because I think you have consistency and durability in that relationship through a project labor agreement. What you're hearing from folks is a philosophical disagreement about project labor agreements. 70% of contractors who have done contracts with Oregon Department of Transportation have worked under a PLA. This isn't new for them. PLAs are very common in the state of Washington. So if there's anything uncommon about this, was where I ended up saying, I'm going to do an executive order because we have inconsistency across the state enterprise of how project labor agreements are being utilized. And that causes a problem, particularly when some projects do require project labor agreements, for example, for the federal government. We don't have a good, consistent approach to doing that. So what I decided to do, and took many months to kind of figure out the language, was to do an executive order and say, this is the expectation for large projects. There is an off-ramp if they're not as complex or not as big and everybody agrees we don't really need one. People can petition for that. But for large, complex construction projects, particularly in the transportation arena, there should be a project labor agreement. And I don't believe it's going to blow a big hole in the budget, because the folks who are saying that can't show me the numbers. And yet we see other numbers where in some places across the country, when PLAs were employed, they've actually saved money. When you don't have labor disruptions, when everybody knows the rules of the road through a project labor agreement, and you don't have to be union, it's union and non-union, employer and workers alike, this is an agreement before you start a project that says this is how we're going to do it. I think it's in the best interest of the state for stewarding the resources to get a big project done. We just have a philosophical disagreement about it.
Yeah, and can you just be clear what the tipping point was again? You said you were seeing problems or difficulties in mismatches between projects, like...
Well, prior to coming into office, I had pushed as speaker that we should move into project labor agreements, community benefit agreements, whatever you want to call them, in our major transportation projects. And it was causing a whole lot of like, well, what are we doing? We need some guidelines. So what you see in my executive order is here are some of the standards we want to meet. We went with a 15% number instead of saying projects of a certain size, because those numbers are always different. You could have a project at 25 million that's really complex with many different types of trades where a project labor agreement would be helpful. Or you could have a project that's $30 million where you have, it's a type of project where you might have one trade doing something and there's no complexity, you don't really need an agreement. So what I want to do is not specify too much, but say, sit down, figure out what works for the project and get it done. And we did the FAQ because, frankly, there are political disagreements about this, so there were lots of questions. I put more answers out there. If we need more answers, we'll give more answers. But at the end of the day, this is about stewarding the resources of the state for large projects.
Okay, I'm sorry, that took long.
I know, sorry, that was my opus on PLAs. Okay, so.
This is interesting. There's been a lot of talk about sexual abuse in schools lately, a lot of cases, a lot of, alleged victims coming forward. With your education package, is there anything that you're looking at in terms of extra enforcement for some of the guidelines the state already has? Are you talking to the Department of Education heads about what they're doing to make sure some of Oregon's laws are enforced in school districts?
Not currently looking at new enforcement laws. There are really good protections on the books. We might need to do additional training with some of our districts. I know you're probably referring to the situation in the St. Helens School District.
But there have been a lot more since then, too.
And what I have picked up from those stories is that we need to re-up what the rules are, what the laws are, what the training should be. Educators are mandatory reporters. They know that. Over the last 6 to 8 years in the legislature, there has been a lot more clarity of who investigates, how you report. We have some really good protections on the books, but I feel like we have some districts who need a refresher course. So I'm going to focus there with the department instead of anything new, because I do think the protections are good.
Quick follow-up to that, there's a lot of money being spent in some of these situations where people are on administrative years, sometimes for years on end as these cases are going forward. TSPC has a huge backlog in their licensing, looking into that. Are you doing anything to make sure that TSPC is staffed enough to deal with that backlog and get these administrative situations figured out more quickly so schools are not paying that money?
Yeah, I have been focused on the efficiency and effectiveness of what's happening at TSPC. And remember, Their backlog is related to what they do if someone should keep their license. They're not the investigators of abuse in the districts. That falls to Department of Human Services, or in criminal cases, local law enforcement. But my budget does include additional resources for TSPC to strengthen, reduce their backlog, get caught up, because it is important to have the oversight agency actually staying a lot more current with the problems that are coming to their attention. Thanks for the question.
Hi.
Hey.
I just want to ask about, well, the last couple biennia, Oregon House Community Services has grown by a lot, and it has received so much money. Your budget, again, allocates a lot of money toward it. About a year ago, the Secretary of State did an audit that showed that they kind of misspent substantial amount of money. It's so hard to keep track of that amount of money. What kind of oversight have you offered, or what kind of tracking are you doing to make sure that money is going where it's supposed to be going?
Yep. So one of the things that was really important to me when I came into this job was to really dig into how every pretty substantial agency is doing their job. And Housing and Community Services is one of those. That audit that was done, I just want to remind people, was specific to the exponentially fast ramp up of the emergency assistance dollars during the pandemic. There were a lot of good points raised, and I think that audit and the work that's been done by the agency has really improved how they do business. Since coming into office, my team meets directly and regularly with Director Bell's staff. They've done some restructuring internally. They've had some outside consultants to talk about how they can do business differently, because they have also recognized they have grown substantially. And so they need to be stable, they need to have good processes, they've worked on procurement. I'm not saying everything is completely where it needs to be, but there has been improvement. And because we know when they are charged with working on the top priority for the state, in my mind, housing and homelessness, they have to have their ducks in a row, and I think we're getting there. So we can get some more details about what has changed, but we have been focusing on that. Usually I'm like, it's not enough to say what we want to do. I ask questions like, well, how are you going to do that? Do you have the staff? Do you have the protocols to do that? And that's why when we built their budget, I said, let me know if you need something else. You have important work. You need to have the staff to do the work you do. And we didn't have to do a lot of new FTE because they've done some restructuring, but we have to make sure the job can get done.
And they have the infrastructure in place to be tracking those dollars, and you guys are watching that as well?
Much better than we had 2 years ago. We have dashboards now. We have regular reporting. One of the things I implemented under the homelessness emergency was something that we use in the IT world, which is, you have these, I forget what they call them in the IT world, but, it says green, red, yellow, it's, okay, green, we're hitting our mark. Yellow, we have concerns. Red, we're out of alignment. We started to go to that kind of motion. So we can look down quickly. We're in green, that's a yellow. What's going on? We need to fix it. Look, things happen all the time, but I think internally they have put a lot more mechanisms in place to track how they're doing, and I'm really pleased with their progress.
Okay, one just really quick follow-up on that. In the state of the state, you said you wanted to see more transparency and accountability with state agency rulemaking. Could you just offer me some specifics about what
Yes.
that looks like in your mind?
I can.
Thanks.
So a couple months ago, I'm losing track of time, I sat down with a variety of leaders in the business community
Unknown participant is now joining.
who were expressing some serious concerns about the number of rulemakings that are happening, and there are a lot, because every time a law is passed or anytime something happens at the state, you have to make a new rule. And if you're tracking these in a particular area, whether it's agriculture or transportation, whatever it is, it's a lot. So what we were hearing from folks is, there's no one place I can find out all the rulemaking that's happening. Now, some agencies, you go on their website, they're really crystal clear. We know that these are the rules we're going to do in this calendar year. Here's where you can find out about it. It's all in one spot. Other agencies, it's a little bit of a mystery. So we're having a conversation about, can we put it all in one spot? Can all the agencies have similar protocols for notifying people when they have rulemaking? If we can get better alignment and consistency across the enterprise, it's going to be good for Oregonians. So that's where we're starting. And legislators are talking about the same thing. Rulemaking has to happen, but let's do it in a way that everyone feels like they're heard. Even if we disagree at the end, they knew what was happening, they knew they could be involved, they know when it ends. Really basic stuff. And I can't say we know that right now across the agencies. There's too much variation. I would like less variation across the agencies.
So about a year ago, you and I sat down for an interview, had a one-on-one. We talked a lot about the mental health crisis, and we also talked about, some of the investments that you wanted to make first in, more secure facilities for those higher acuity patients. But you did mention that in 2025, a year from now, at the time of the interview, that you had an appetite to take up, the issue of civil commitments and lowering that bar to get people the help that they need. So I just want to check in to see, where do you stand today?
Yes. There has been a lot of good work by community partners, particularly NAMI, over the last year to talk about what can we do to improve criteria for civil commitment to help people get the health care they need when they have decompensated. It's really important. They will have legislation. I have expressed to legislative leaders who are working on the bill, this is important. We need to talk about this. In my State of the State, I talked about the state hospital and how it's become almost exclusively a place for folks who are on aid and assist. People who have potentially committed crimes, have to go get treatment so they can go back to court. I believe we can catch some of those folks earlier, and improvements in civil commitment are necessary. And I agree with NAMI, if we're going to change at some point the criteria for civil commitment and make it a clearer pathway to get someone to health care when they are decompensating, we have to also make sure that communities have the resources when someone has been stabilized to go to. So it's not just, you can't just change the criteria and then someone's going to be, where are they going to go? So we got to do both. But we have to have that conversation, and I'm supportive of what NAMI is trying to do.
And, the work group, Commitment to Change, they just put out the recommendations in recent months. Some of the families who are participated in that, have suffered from, not being able to get their adult children the help that they need with their severe mental illness, and that has led to suicide and even homicide. So some of the families felt like, because the work group was required to have 100% consensus on all of the recommendations, that it was really watered down. So I was just curious, if you've seen those recommendations, what your thoughts are, and if the legislature had an appetite to take it further.
So my team has read all the proposals out there. I want to thank the Chief Justice for doing the Committed to Change work group, and what they're recommending, I would put in the housekeeping category and should get done. And I think we need to go further, and that's why I think the NAMI bills, I agree, I don't think they went far enough.
I know you're backing a bill to encourage more middle housing, which has obviously been a priority for you for years, but we're still not seeing that many duplexes and triplexes built compared to larger apartment buildings or single-family homes. How much of that is something that the state can address through reducing regulations or anything you're trying to do at the legislative level, and how much of this depends on what developers and what the market want to build and what people want to buy?
Yep. So and when talking about housing development, it's usually, three-legged stool. You need to have the state regulatory environment that allows for innovation and flexibility. And this bill that I'm working on is a result of feedback from folks like, we want to do middle housing, but here are some of the things we're running into, like certain pieces of land we can't use. So it's kind of the second version of trying to promote middle housing. At the local level, and again, I was in Bend yesterday talking about middle housing, we need to continue to increase technical assistance for our local government. Some communities have really embraced middle housing. They've made it work. They figured out how to do it. Others are just really struggling because it's a real sea change for them to do this and what they have on, what they're doing in terms of their local ordinances. So that technical assistance is going to be important. And then the other piece of that is, where is the private sector? What I heard yesterday from Deborah Flagan out of Hayden Homes is that because of middle housing, she was, and I think it's in Jonathan Bach's article today, her ability to go from a set number of units to more, because there's shared walls, there's different options, we can build more for new construction coming online. And I would just say, I won't share names, but I heard today that someone just got into their first home because a duplex was available for home purchase. That was at the price point this person could afford. This is also about home ownership, and that's what we saw in Bend yesterday. Different types of middle housing, cottage clusters, other things, where people can buy and become homeowners for the first time. So we still need lots of big apartments. We're never going to stop building single-family standalones, but we have to have middle housing to fill in the gap. And I think we're just at the cusp of seeing more of this happening because people are getting more comfortable with it. The bill I'm working on will make that easier.
Governor, my first question is just a clarifying one around PSH double plus plus. I heard you say earlier that you're hoping for more supportive housing, and then also was the plus plus part of that including additional wraparound services?
Yeah, good question. Yes, so I've been starting to shift my thinking about the $80 million that we have for the construction, right? And really putting some clear parameters on that, because I think we have to build properties that will be better suited for more wraparound services. So there is some kind of physical, like what we're building has to be right. We have always, when we've passed the construction dollars, we've also passed dollars for supportive services. We're going to have more on that end. So I'm going to have to come back to the legislature to build on my recommended budget of, okay, what we're hearing from folks is we need more there. So the ability to have more on-site staffing, the ability to just do more for those clients who have, frankly, very long-term chronic health issues that will require not full, residential, but someone who's there on a regular basis to help them stay on track. So that will take supportive service dollars. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
One more question. You said you're looking forward to hearing ideas around lowering costs for Oregonians. At the same time, we're looking at a transportation package that is going to have to get funded somehow, and it looks like fees are going to be probably part of that. How do you balance those two realities?
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll have success in other areas where we might have, if you're, someone who's paying something to drive, there will be increased costs. What I like about the work I'm hearing from some of the legislators around lowering utility costs, making sure that, you are protected from scams and other things so you can keep more of your own money in your pocket. It's not a zero-sum game. Some things might have increased costs, but if there are other ways to decrease costs, that will help, households across the state. So I think we're going to see that from the legislature as well. In the transportation package, we haven't talked about this at all, but, the current payroll tax that pays for transit is also important. So we also give options for people if driving does become too expensive for some folks, that there is more transit as well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So with funding more low-income housing, supportive housing, et cetera, are you doing anything to make sure that some of these developers that the state is working with and paying millions of dollars to every year are also held accountable for the standards for tenants? Are there any forums that tenants can speak about how dollars are being spent? Because Oregon Housing and Community Services has closed down one of the few open public comments where tenants could go and talk about some of these issues. So now their only way is emailing and leaving messages, and they feel like they're not being heard. Some of these low-income tenants that have below standard housing and are, one of your low-income developers that is a prominent low-income developer in the state is being fined millions of dollars by the city, but still making millions of dollars from the state. So how do you sort of hold them accountable?
Well, hopefully, I'm not sure of the resource you're referring to where it has been shut down. So if you could get me that info, because I do, if we're not providing a venue for residents to let us know how things are going, we could improve upon that. But remember, they're not our properties. We're a funder. Health and safety is important, making sure that people are meeting the specifications that they've been approved for the funding. And frankly, we have some developers who have not held up their end of the bargain. So we're on top of those situations when, money has gone out the door and projects aren't where they need to be. When it comes to once they are open, that is a little more challenging, right? Because we don't own the properties. They're owned by the developers or the property managers or whatever. And often we rely on our nonprofit partners who advocate for tenants and things like that. So I'm open to figuring out how we can get more information back to the agency, but currently there aren't particular enforcement mechanisms once the project is done, from my understanding.
Some would argue that those enforcement mechanisms are not continuing to fund a developer who has ongoing issues.
Well, I would be very interested in knowing which developers we're talking about, because in many cases, some of these enforcements opportunities, mechanisms, or whatever are at the local level. And so if cities don't feel like they have the tools they need to hold people accountable, we should talk about it.
There's been a lot of coverage on the milepost 5 issues that have been going on for years, and tenants have been trying to communicate with Oregon Housing and Community Services. They feel like their voice is not being heard. This has been going on for over 4 or 5 years now. That same developer has also been fined by the city of Portland and hasn't paid those fines yet. They have a lien on the property, yet they're still getting funded by Oregon Housing Community Services.
Well, in terms of new funding, if someone has a lien, if you're a developer and you have a lien and you have a bad track record, I am sure that the agency has taken that into account for future funding, but I'll have to follow up with you because I've seen some of the reporting on milepost, but I don't totally understand the connection of what the state should be doing.
Are you considering opening a forum where tenants, low-income that live in these low-income developments that the state is funding, have a forum to talk about some of the issues that they're experiencing?
Well, we're not currently set up for that, but I'm always open to make sure that folks who are not being served well have a voice somewhere, so we should talk about it.
Hi, Governor. I wanted to ask you about, there was recently a contempt filing in the litigation of the state hospital by Disability Rights Oregon that said that they did it because lawyers for the health authority said that they had no plan to get the state back into compliance with the 7-day admission requirement. I want to see if, want to ask how we got here, if you could comment on how we got here, and if this the possibility of a contempt filing changes how you approach this legislative session in the state hospital.
So since coming into office 2 years ago, I have been very focused on making sure we're meeting the legal requirements under Mink and Mossman for the state hospital, and we also are working with Dr. Pinels for the remediation. There is money in my budget to help the state hospital. You heard me talk about it in my speech. I am very committed to making sure the state hospital functions better for everybody involved. And all I will say about for Disability Rights Oregon, they can do whatever they want. Just because they think we're not participating, that's their point of view. We are heavily engaged to make this work, and I think we are authentically trying to solve the problems at the state hospital.
Another very, very in the weeds question. The federal health authorities say that the state needs to wind down its prioritized list for covered Medicaid services.
You are getting weedy.
Yes, I mean, nobody, who else is going to do it?
Right.
Well, but so with that, so how there is a legislative process that it needs to go through. How important do you think that the legislature sticks to the timeline for unwinding the prioritized list that is called for by the Oregon Health Authority?
Well, we have to meet the timeline as proposed by the federal government. They have said to us that, for those of you who haven't followed Oregon Health Plan all your years, one of the fundamental foundations of the Oregon Health Plan was a prioritized list of what services would be covered. And there were often conversations where that line would get cut off over the years, if you all remember budget cuts over the years. The federal government has said, your prioritized list, thing of the past, you got to fix it, right? So what we've been advising the agency, and what the agency is engaged in, is talking with everyone how to unwind from that. What I've been coaching and hoping for is, let's not try to solve everything with this. Let's just meet the goals by the federal government and see where we land, because it's so ingrained in how we do the health plan. We want to unwind in a way that it doesn't disrupt anything else. But it is going to be a sea change when it's all said and done.
Okay. Do you have just one more follow-up? Do you have any ideas of what to replace the prioritized list with, like a mechanism for making sure that necessary services that are supported by evidence are actually covered?
Well, I'm hoping we can maintain our commitment here in the state that began with Governor Kitzhaber of evidence-based practice. The HERC, the Evidence-Based Review Commission, I forget what the HERC is going to still stay there, and there are some changes at the HERC coming. I'm hoping we don't lose evidence-based practice, and we have put a lot of cost controls into how we run Medicaid here in the state under our CCOs. So, because originally that was why the prioritized list was really a bedrock, right? That's how we're going to control costs. We're now controlling costs differently. So I can't really answer the question of what replaces it, because it was originally about cost containment. I feel like we have other mechanisms in place to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hey.
Good afternoon. Hi.
Oregon Health Plan, no.
No. Governor Kotek, thank you. If I recall correctly, your budget calls for more than $173 million toward preventing homelessness in the first place. There's been legislation passed in the last 2 years with a really vast amount of money toward preventing homelessness, providing rental assistance, that kind of thing. And yet there's still about, if I remember right, about 2,300 eviction cases being filed every month right now over the last year. And those cases have increased over the last 2 years. I know you've heard about this. Can you talk more about what your budget would do specifically around preventing homelessness and how those funds that you're proposing would make progress, ensure that there aren't so many people who are on the brink of eviction and homelessness?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to have more money for eviction prevention in my budget. It is, we know, the most cost-effective way to help people not experience homelessness. And what you see in my budget is a balancing act between continuing to maintain a statewide shelter system. So there is a place for someone to go. It's not going to serve every person who's unsheltered, but we're at over 4,500 shelter beds across the state. We need to maintain those so people have a place to go to get to stability, to transition. Then, I think our next priority there is money to support rehousing. So when someone has become stable in a shelter situation, they can get rehoused. And then making sure we also at the front end have more money for eviction prevention. I have heard from some legislators who are like, your homelessness package is quite large. And I'm like, yes, because we're in a crisis and it is improving, but we need to stay the course. If I had more dollars, or if the federal government wanted to give us more money for rent assistance, I would know where to spend it. So I'm glad we have the numbers we do have, but it is very difficult to go bigger than that number right now because of all the other priorities in the state. But yes, and we are seeing more evictions, and I think you heard about it in my State of the State. You know, when I'm gonna make a plug to our landlords, if someone is paying their rent and you don't have a problem with them, you need to keep renting to them. When I heard about the gentleman up in Astoria who was like, look, I was paying my rent. I lived here for years. Like, there were no problems. They just didn't want to re-up my lease. And I lost my housing. We have to really think about the impact. And he even said his property manager felt really bad about it. So this was coming from somewhere else. When rental properties are run strictly on profit motives from someone who lives out of state, it has impact on people's lives. And so this gentleman was just beyond frustrated because he was not even given a reason why his lease wasn't re-upped. We really have to have a conversation in the state about keeping people housed. If they're doing everything right, keep them housed.
So I've been speaking with some, advocates for landlords and property managers. Some of them, I know this is not going to be news to you, think that the legislation passed a couple years ago, forgive me, I'm forgetting the name, that gave, tenants more time, extended the length around the eviction notice from 72 hours to 10 days, and, gave them up until judgment to make payments. That basically their point is that landlords are filing lots of these eviction cases because it just allows renters to forego paying rent for until whenever. And I kind of just wonder, and they say that basically people are abusing the system in that way. I don't know, what's your response to that that notion?
Well, like anything, you probably have some folks. You have some landlords who could be better people. You have tenants who could be better people. I think that those are the exception, not the rule. I do think that the legislation that has been passed to provide more predictability for tenants has really kept people housed. But like anything, I am always open to hear from anybody who says we could do it better. I do think the legislation we've passed has provided stability for folks. And I think there are a lot of landlords and property owners who do it right, and people are staying housed because of the notification and a little bit of grace that has been put into the system. And I can't explain why we're seeing the eviction numbers other than people frankly can't afford their housing. I think that's the biggest driver, right? People just don't make enough and their rents keep going up.
I would ask one more quick one.
Yep.
We keep hearing from the legislature they want to do oversight. You came from the legislature, but they are saying we have done a really bad job of keeping the executive in check and doing what it should be and operating efficiently. I wonder what you make of that. I mean, I assume you would say you welcome the scrutiny, but help me understand how you look at this, because they are talking a lot about it.
Yeah. And we've been having some of those conversations with the folks who are interested. I do welcome the scrutiny. And it's one of the reasons, like I mentioned in my speech on Monday, is why I wanted this job. The fact that we now have a way of tracking whether our agencies have implemented the audit recommendations that have come from the Secretary of State is a substantial improvement. I have, in most cases, read a lot of those audits. And I'm like, where are we on this? Are we doing something on this? We are now tracking that. I know that might sound small, but people are frustrated, like, we want to see improvement, you're not doing it. Well, we're tracking, if we haven't figured it, we can go to a spot and say, hey, agency, why haven't you done this? I think that the rulemaking conversation is important because I think that clarity. I also want to push it back a little bit on the legislature, and I was one of those too. We gave agencies a lot of new things to do in the last 5 to 6 years. And we probably didn't resource them well enough, and we didn't ask them if they were going to have quality controls. I am asking those questions now. I ask those questions all the time to agencies. How are you showing me that you're improving your outcomes? Do you have processes in place that improve that? We can improve things, and we are seeing improvements in quite a few agencies. So I hear what legislators are saying. I also think there's a difference between the executive branch and the legislative branch. I welcome the oversight, and the executive needs to do the job, and I am doing the job with my agencies to actually improve what they do. So I feel like we're making improvement. I'll be interested to see what they want to do differently. I'm always open. What I don't want to see is a lot more reporting, because I think the reporting doesn't solve anything. It's just like, hey, I got one more report. Did you read it? It's not about reporting. It's about having work plans, having strategic goals, staffing appropriately, and knowing if you hit your mark. If you did it, go back and keep going, right? Get back, and work harder, which is what my message to my agency folks all the time.
Was it a criticism you had as speaker? Do you think that oversight has been lax in the legislature?
I think the oversight mechanisms that have been there for many, many years were not up for the expansion under the pandemic and all the things that the legislature has been doing. Our budgets have grown. What agencies have been asked to do has grown. I'm trying to course correct on that and put more internal controls on the executive so we know how we're doing. And I think we're finding that out. I think we've had to modernize on the executive side that we didn't have before. We can always be better at continuous improvement, quality control, metrics, transparency. You probably have seen more dashboards coming out of my administration than we had before. Like, that's all part of the package.
Okay. Thanks, Governor. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for making some time to hear us talk about the session today. I'm Julie Fahey. I'm the Speaker of the Oregon House, and I represent a district in Lane County, West Eugene and Veneta. And we have a lot of work to do this legislative session on a number of big issues. We've got to make sure that our government is working and that it's working for everyday people. So what that means to me is that Oregonians can afford housing and healthcare and childcare, and that there aren't people sleeping on the streets, and that we've got an education system where students are showing up ready to learn and are getting a quality education, and a transportation system that is safe and efficient. So here is what we're going to focus on this session. We are leading, first and foremost, with affordability and cost of living. That is something that is very top of mind for Oregonians right now. And so we know that although there are things that at the federal level or at the global level that we can't impact, there are big ticket items at the state level that we can and will make a difference on. Housing, utilities, healthcare, for example. On housing, we are going to continue on all of our commitments on housing investments and to partner with the governor on meeting the ambitious goals that she has set, including for affordable housing. There'll be some additional policy work this session and, of course, continued investments in affordable and permanent supportive housing. On healthcare, one of the big things we'll take up this session, we will continue some conversations on prescription drug affordability, including talking about pharmacy benefit managers, the middlemen of the pharmaceutical industries. But one of the big things we'll take up is renewing our funding mechanism for the Medicaid finance, for our Medicaid program. We need to renew that funding mechanism to make sure that Oregonians don't lose critical access to care. 1 in 3 Oregonians and half of all children in this state receive their health care coverage through the Oregon Health Plan. But importantly, the way we fund our Medicaid system here in Oregon helps us draw down federal resources and helps make sure that providers have the resources they need to ensure to serve our whole communities and keep healthcare affordable. On utilities, I know we will consider making changes to the rate setting process and ensuring that as we see rising demand for electricity from data centers and other big users, that those folks are paying their fair share and that costs for that increased demand are not being shifted onto residential customers. On transportation, obviously a big topic of conversation leading up into the session. We had our Joint Transportation Committee do a statewide tour over the last year to listen to communities' needs. And we know that Oregonians in all corners of the state want a transportation system that is safe, reliable, and effective. That means getting to and from work with fewer hassles. It means bridges are safe and seismically resilient. And it means options like transit, bike, and pedestrian infrastructure so people have choices about how they get around. But the way that we fund our transportation system is rapidly becoming outdated and insufficient to cover basic operations, maintenance, and safety. We're not alone in this problem. Every state in the country is facing this issue, and my hope is that we can fix it in a way that is unique to Oregon. On education, we have one of our most important responsibilities in this state is funding our school system. But I strongly believe that those investments cannot be a blank check. We have to ensure that student outcomes in our K-12 schools are improving and that we have concrete evidence-based plans to get there. We will have a number of proposals we'll consider this session related to accountabilities and outcomes in our K-12 education system. And continuing on the theme of accountability, I know Representative Leader Bowman will talk about this, but we're also recommitting to our responsibility as a legislature to ensure that our government is working. And that means that our state agencies are functioning efficiently, that they're using taxpayer dollars wisely, and that they're accountable to the people of Oregon. That requires legislative oversight and holding agencies accountable. So it requires changing a little bit about how we do business in this building. And I know Representative Bowman can speak to that more given the bipartisan work group he's been leading. From the federal, we know we'll have a new federal administration starting next week. And I strongly believe that we cannot be distracted by the new administration, but we have a big agenda of things that I just laid out. But we are ready to fight for Oregonians if and when we need to. So we will protect Oregonians' values and we will defend all of our constitutional rights and basic freedoms. Those are the high-level, big-picture things that we'll take on. Of course, there are always a long list of other important work that happens in the legislature, everything from continuing our homelessness and behavioral health investments, to wildfire funding, to climate and the environment. There's always a very long list of things that we take up in the legislature, but I really believe, as Speaker, that it's important to set priorities. We saw that in the last short session in 2024, where we had a session that was narrowly focused on addiction and community safety, housing and homelessness, and campaign finance reform. And so, just like last session, I think you will also see a fair amount of overlap between the high-level priorities that I talked about and the things that at least I have seen the Republican leaders lay out. Making Oregon more affordable, fixing our schools, addressing homelessness, making it easier to build housing, and holding state agencies accountable. I think that's good news, and I think it's a sign that both parties are listening to what Oregonians want. They have been very clear over the last few years about what their priorities are. And sometimes we'll have some of the same ideas about how we get there, and sometimes we will, my Republican colleagues will have some different ideas. But we all know that we need to step up and get the work done for Oregonians. So I appreciate you having us here and happy to take questions, but I'll turn it over to Leader Drazan first.
Hi, I am Christine Drazan. I'm the House Republican leader going into the 2025 legislative session, and it's a privilege to be here today with you guys. The House Republicans are committed to putting Oregonians at the center of every single conversation that we have inside this building. And so when we look at some of the issues that Speaker Fahey lined out, there is no doubt that there's just ample opportunity for us to work together. This could be an incredibly strong bipartisan legislative session. The concerns that Oregonians are facing right now around affordability are extraordinary. Oregonians themselves are calling on us to do more with less and not ask them to write that blank check. They don't want to do that. They're not prepared to do it. They can't afford to do it. And I think that on both sides of the aisle that we recognize that that's the reality for Oregonians right now. What we will continue to apply pressure on is that not just that we resist the tendency within this building to constantly ratchet up costs on Oregonians, but also that we take that next step and that we ensure that these dollars are being wisely spent. And so that means in particular when we have these conversations about solving these big challenges, that when if you just review any number of the task force reports or any number of the small groups that have met, the solution will typically have a price tag that's not insignificant associated with how to get there, how to solve these challenges. So as House Republicans, we will be trying to work across the aisle and invite our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to recognize also the need to cut government where it is inefficient or ineffective or not meeting the needs and the goals that Oregonians themselves expect them to meet. And at the same time, also not being all things to all people. We need to prioritize, and I think everyone recognizes that. We don't print money in the state of Oregon, so the only way we expand would be to raise taxes. And this session in particular, Oregonians are saying, we can't afford it. And so if we can't afford it, and we share these values and these goals to make life better for Oregonians, then we're going to have to prioritize. We're going to have to make some hard choices as a body. It happens every session. Every session there's a range of priorities that some things get accomplished, some things don't get accomplished. But I really feel strongly that there is some alignment about what Oregonians themselves are prioritizing right now. And it is affordability, and it's homelessness. And I also would like to elevate the issue of education. In particular, our caucus is very engaged on issues not just of accountability, but also restoring some standards inside our classroom, making our diploma mean something, and helping our students not just simply achieve a credential, but prepare for their best future and their best life. And that doesn't happen automatically in the system that we have right now, which has just been pushing kids along through this process. We have some of the worst absenteeism rates that we have seen across the nation in the state of Oregon. That has got to change. When we're looking at kids that are missing 10% or more of the school year, how can we possibly expect them to succeed? That is not a question of how the system is funded. That's a culture question. That's a leadership question. That's a question for families as well as teachers. And so from the perspective of House Republicans, we want to be elevating the conversations around education because that's the future of our state. We are looking forward to engaging in conversations about how our economy works, how we can make this a state that is attractive to business. We just saw all of the federal investment in chips, the big investments, go to other places. Oregon was not an attractive state in the end to be competitive for the major investments that other states received. The question must be, we had the adequate land supply. If it wasn't that, what was it? And I would argue when you listen to the business community, when you listen to the job creators across our state, they feel burdened by not just the regulatory environment, but the tax environment. We know that Oregon is a high tax state, and we have a complex regulatory environment in this state that doesn't always make it the natural choice to grow and expand. And when we look at what we need in the long term, our population numbers have plateaued. And that has always been the saving grace for our state, is that our population has climbed, and it's helped us with our budgets, it's helped us providing needed services. If that's going to change, we need to start to look to the parts of our economy that can bring in workers and bring in workforce, recognizing that at the same time, those folks need to be able to afford to live here. And so these issues are intertwined, they're interconnected. I think there's great opportunity to work in a bipartisan way towards accountability, and in particular, maintaining this priority that we help this state become more affordable for Oregonians themselves. And I think I will say one last thing on transportation. This is a question that's coming up a little bit in conversations that I've had leading into this session, transportation package as a concept. And I would say this, I think there's, again, a shared kind of understanding that we must have a transportation system that works. You can't have bridges collapse. We have got to fill potholes. We have got to have them plow these roads. How do we do that when, in particular, on my side of the aisle, I don't trust the agency to do what it says? There was accountability in the 2017 package. There was regular reporting. There were clear expectations in the legislation. There was clear authority in the legislation, and yet they didn't perform. And so now they've got their hand out and they're saying, we need more, we want more. And from our perspective, we need them to succeed. What's changed? I have yet to hear that from the agency, and I look forward to beginning those conversations. I think the last thing that I would say is, as we look at this for Oregon and the future of our state, we cannot leave behind the people that are facing addiction and the families that are impacted by both addiction and homelessness. We have seen our numbers related to fentanyl overdose deaths double in 1 year. Double in a 1 year period. That's unacceptable. And so I think that as we're having these conversations and we talk about how we're going to address these crises, we need more than just money on the table. We need more than just systems conversations. We need to have a conversation about how this affects people and whether or not this will serve the exact person that's facing the crisis at that time. And I feel confident that House Republicans are ready to do this work, and we are ready to work across the aisle, and we invite our Democrat colleagues to join us.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Bowman, State Representative from House District 25, most of the city of Tigard, some of South Beaverton, and the unincorporated community of Metzger. And I am also the House Majority Leader, elected last spring. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. I want to talk a little bit about the House Democrats' agenda for this session. We construct our agenda based on what we hear from voters during the campaign. We finish the campaign, and then we try to collect the data that we heard on the doorstep and from voters about what they want us to address as their government. That is how small d democracy is supposed to work. And so here are the categories that we are thinking about as we're entering this session that we want to focus on, that we want to prioritize. And I will preview. You're going to hear overlap on what I say from what we heard from Leader Drazan and from the Speaker. I do think these are widely felt priorities in this state, which is a huge opportunity for us as a legislature. First and foremost, affordability. It cuts across all different aspects of people's lives, but there are a lot of folks in this state who are struggling to afford housing. They can't make their rent payments. They certainly can't afford houses. People in my generation, millennials, are struggling to buy houses. They're buying them much later than our parents' generations were. But it's also true for prescription drugs and other healthcare costs, utilities, childcare. Costs are really high, and Oregonians need help. There are things outside of our control, but there are things inside of our control too, and we'll be working on those this session. Category number 2, very passionate about this, is making government work. And again, lots of overlap and I think shared priorities here. We ran a work group, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, that came up with a series of recommendations that we can talk about. But the idea here is, let's close the gap between our intentions with our policies and our budgets and what's actually being felt by Oregonians. I think it's important to note here, what I'm not interested in is the DC-style gotcha partisan oversight that you see regardless of who's in power in Congress. Oregon has historically done things differently, and I hope that our oversight and accountability will be focused on solutions, which was the explicit focus of the Democrats and Republicans on the work group, and I expect will be felt branch-wide as well. Third category is keeping Oregonians safe. Public safety is a really important priority for Oregonians. One data point for this is House Bill 4002, which we passed in the short session to address public safety and the addiction crisis in the state. Wildly popular bill. I think I read in the Oregonian, it's like 75% approval rate just in the Portland metro area, which wasn't clear when we passed that bill how it was going to be received by voters. But I think it tells us something about the need for public safety. People want to feel safe walking their kids to school. They want to feel safe going to pick up groceries. And that's got to be a continued priority for us in the state because we've got work left to do. Category 4 is protecting the basic rights and freedoms of Oregonians. This is a politically fraught moment. There's lots of rhetoric at the national level. We are not going to take our eye off the ball and be reactive to the federal government, but we are going to be clear-eyed about our responsibility to protect the rights and freedoms of Oregonians. So that will be a consistent theme throughout this session as well. And then finally, there's a lot of really intense needs that we have to address right now. There's also a need for us as a legislature to be thoughtful about our future. We need to be thinking about things like economic development, like the climate crisis, like early childhood education, investments we make now that will make our state even better in the decades to come. So we're going to be thinking not just in the short term, but also in the medium and long term about what's in the best interest of the state. So now I think I'm going to hand it over to Julia.
Did we lose Julia? I think it's
Free for all.
free for all once you lose your person.
Hi. I would love to hear more about your plans for state agency oversight. And this seems to be a theme from all of you. I think historically, lawmakers often did see their role as sort of being a watchdog over agencies, and I don't think that's the culture anymore. I think I would argue Senator Gelser-Bluin is probably like one of the more notable watchdog type people over her committee and the state agency that she often deals with. And she's, they just drafted a bill to undo a lot of her legislation. They didn't bring her in on the meetings. The executive office doesn't always include her. It's not really like she's embraced for taking on that role. So it seems like it would be a pretty massive cultural shift to start thinking that way. So how are you going to do that?
I'm happy to lead off and then would welcome thoughts and opinions. Really good question. I think the word culture is a key component of what's changed. I was talking to Phil Kiesling, former Secretary of State in Oregon, who said that the culture used to be you'd pass a bill, you'd work that bill throughout the session, then you'd watchdog implementation of the bill, and then the next session you'd follow up on the bill and you'd keep your eye on that priority. You'd fight through the budget process to continue to make sure that that priority receives funding, and it would sort of be part of your work as a legislator. And I think we have strayed from that a little bit. The other thing that former Secretary of State Kiesling said that has resonated with me in this topic is a lot of our biggest problems are public administration problems, not public policy problems. Sometimes the solution isn't to pass more bills. Sometimes the solution is actually to provide oversight to improve the program. So here's some of the high-level recommendations that we came forward in the work group, but I think there's plenty of other things we didn't cover. First, we already did, which is we brought in the Levin Center for Government Oversight to provide a training to chairs and vice chairs to help with exactly what you're talking about, help chairs and vice chairs of both parties interpret oversight as part of their function as a legislator. It's not just creating new laws, it's also oversight for agencies. We're going to do a better job of making sure the Secretary of State's audits are being received not just by the Joint Legislative Committee on Audits, but also by the relevant policy and budget subcommittees who oversee those program areas, so that those recommendations from the professional auditors are being incorporated into our process as a legislature. We want to help design oversight hearings that don't fall into the traps of DC, but also are maybe a little bit more than we've historically done with what we call our informational meetings. So allowing our LPRO analysts, Legislative Policy and Research Office, provide overviews of the legislation, historical record of what has gone on in the legislature before we hand it over to the agency. Agencies should be given very specific questions in a very finite amount of time, and then making sure that there's opportunity for legislators from the dais to ask those hard questions and then follow up at them in future meetings. There's a host of other smaller recommendations. I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but I think there's definitely room and opportunity this session to improve our oversight practices.
So I would add to that, and thank you for your good work. I know that my Republican members that have been participating in that group, I really feel like it's a very, very needed and productive conversation. And they are looking forward to the fruits of their labors this session, seeing some of those proposals implemented at a committee level. I mean, structurally, I'm the House Republican leader, and I can tell you that we see, from sort of a global perspective in the past, prior to this session, sort of a hesitancy from legislative leadership to ever want agencies to look bad. And I think that's a mistake on our part as a legislative branch. We play a critical role in our government as a branch distinct from the executive. And when we had sort of a more political overlay for how we governed from this body, I don't think it did justice to the expectations that Oregonians rightfully hold for how their agencies and their government serves them. And so too often there would be sort of an expectation that you'd kind of turn a blind eye, or you'd fix it in a budget note and cross your fingers and hope for the best. And I think that this expectation that what we're looking at is data. Like, did it work or did it not work? Did you do what you said you were going to do or not? This was the intent of the legislation. Did you go way over with your rulemaking, or were you narrowly focused? I think that's the appropriate role of this body, and I'm super, super excited to be able to participate and exert that kind of autonomy for this branch, and I think it's going to benefit Oregonians. I mean, you know, in lieu of having the ability to have true political balance, where that naturally occurs from the nature of your different roles, we need to recognize just the critical role we play in having a government that functions more effectively for Oregonians themselves, and this is definitely a bipartisan focus this session.
The only thing that I will add to it is just a thank you, and it's a thank you to Leader Bowman and to Representative Wallen and the other members on that work group. I feel like we're very lucky here in the state that we have legislators who are actually willing to roll up their sleeves and do the work, and that's always what matters. Oh no, that's always what matters the most to me as speaker, is like not just people who are willing to talk about, oh, we need more oversight, but who are willing to actually do the nitty gritty and say, here's what that actually means in a legislative context. And not all of it is exciting. I just spoke to my chamber this morning and I was trying to talk about the Legislative Audits Committee and the changes we were going to make. And I was like, I don't know that this is going over all that well, but it's really, really important work.
But also, can I just throw one more thing in? Is that I hope that you guys hold this body accountable for that. I mean, we know, you know, for Senator Bluen in particular, she fights that fight all the time. And yet still, last year, 272 foster kids were still housed in hotel rooms, despite her hard work, despite being dogged on these topics. And so I do think that other side of it is these are good intentions, and this is a plan that hasn't happened before, that's a worthy plan to pursue. And now we also need to see the outcomes at an agency level. We need to see the outcomes on behalf of Oregonians.
Representative Bowman, did you say there's a package of bills as part of this work group?
There will be a couple bills related to this. A lot of this doesn't need a bill. It's cultural. It's leadership decision making. The bills, one of which I think Leader Drazan and I will partner on, is what we're calling OLIS for rulemaking.
Yeah.
So there's frustration felt by stakeholders on all sides of political issues about how the rulemaking process in this state can vary widely agency by agency. It sometimes feels opaque to understand what these rulemaking notices are even about, how I can access participating. And so our goal is to create a process like OLIS, which we actually receive pretty high marks from for being accessible, clear, easy to use, especially relative to the federal level and other states. So that's one legislation, and then piece of legislation. And then the other, which we've already introduced as a committee bill in the Rules Committee, is to create what we're calling the Legislative Auditor Office. An office focused on performance audits, not fiscal audits. That's all Secretary of State's work. But basically to create a professional staff capacity to do the kind of actual oversight work that is needed across policy areas. So the work of our work group has been focused on like the branch's capacity, but doing the actual work of oversight requires probably a little more capacity than a citizen legislature where we have one staff year round and one during the building. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Sorry, apparently I need extra camera angles. In terms of, there's been a lot of talk on both sides about fiscal responsibility and cutting. Where do those cuts need to be made? I also know that you're talking about audits, et cetera. I assume that's work that needs to be done, but do you have a sense of where there is bureaucratic spending that there shouldn't be? Where do you think focuses need to be? What specific state agencies are you saying, hey, we need to look at this more?
Yeah, from my perspective, just to jump right in on this one, we have seen Oregon's budget grow. It's doubled in size in less than a decade. It's about $140 billion currently, and about 10 years ago, it was a little bit under half of that. And everything that we have been doing has not necessarily resulted in the outcomes that Oregonians deserve. So we have unfilled positions across our state right now that I say use it or lose it. We have, if you look across our Capitol Mall, we have building after building empty because state employees can work remotely and do not come to work. And so we have assets sitting out there idle. So the question becomes some of these structural issues around government. If that's not how we're going to function anymore, let's view that as an asset and use it to its best possible use, rather than just paying for it and letting it sit idle. Like some of these issues should not and are not at all partisan. They're just, does this even make sense anymore? And can we save money by looking at it and changing it? I would also say that when we have these programs that are all about pursuing broadly a political agenda that's intended to poke somebody in the eye, and not help our economy and not help our state, then I would say that those are some of the things that we need to put at the top of the possible chopping block. We have hundreds of boards and commissions right now that all have extraordinary control and power and direct a lot of the work of our agencies. And I would cut the fat in a lot of our boards and commissions today and view those as not necessarily beneficial to the work of the legislative body itself. I think there's a lot of places to go for kind of low-hanging fruit for how we can improve accountability and start to trim some of these budgets, really before you get to the core function of performance. But if you just look at some of these outcomes for Oregonians themselves, I think we have lost our way. I look at the Department of Transportation, I was talking about them a little bit earlier, and they have dedicated resources for quite a bit of their work. But when it comes to their core function, which is maintain roads, and oh, by the way, we raise taxes for you to expand roads, and they aren't doing that, then that means that they need an audit that is much deeper than just a fiscal audit, and look at performance and identify areas that they actually could be trimmed before they come to the legislature and ask us to write them a blank check.
Are there other agencies you mentioned, Department of Transportation? Are there other ones you have your eye on?
Well, I think the Oregon Health Authority has ballooned beyond recognition. As an agency, it was only created a little bit over 10 years ago, something along those lines, and it is now the largest agency in the state. And it has some very, very, very important core functions. I mean, they are responsible for Medicaid, and I mean, they matter. And also, there's a lot of fat there. And if you look at the audits that have come out of the Secretary of State's office for the Oregon Health Authority in particular, it's a rounding error for them to lose millions and millions of dollars, and then they get fined by the federal government for how they administered a grant or how they approach things. We're talking about an agency that is too big and is not held to account. So I think that there's absolutely opportunity for us to be better stewards of these dollars on behalf of Oregonians, and those two agencies in particular is where I would start.
And I want to talk about the one aspect of that accountability in the budget, which is what are Oregonians getting for those investments? I think a focus on outcomes is something that, as someone who comes from the business community, I am all about what is our return on investment? And so one of the things that I would flag is over the last 2 years, our approach to our homelessness spending has been a little different than it was in the years before. When Governor Kotek took office, she declared a state of emergency on homelessness, and we in the legislature stepped up to fund that state of emergency. But I think the clear difference between how we approached those resources versus resources in prior years is that they came with the expectation of achieving specific outcomes. Communities had to commit to how many new shelter beds are you going to create, how many evictions are you going to prevent, how many people are you going to prevent from becoming homeless, and then how many people are you going to rapidly rehouse to get them off the streets. And we met those goals that were set out 2 years ago, and I'm proud of the progress we have made on each of those three pieces. And I strongly believe that that's a model that we can use to inform other spending in the areas of state government.
So that one in particular I struggle with whenever I hear anybody talk about how we've made such progress on homelessness. And I would echo that idea that we need to have these expectations that the outcomes match our commitments, and that we've invested this money, we've directed this money, we expect this outcome. When it comes to homelessness, if we met the goal, then the goal was too low. Our homeless numbers have risen by 13%. And let me just put a finer point on that. We have about 23,000 people from our most recent point-in-time count of the number of people that are sleeping on our streets in Oregon. About 60% of those numbers are unaccompanied youth, which is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. Let's put that in the context of Oregon. 214 of Oregon's incorporated cities are smaller than that number. That number is roughly the equivalent of the city of Roseburg. That is not something to celebrate. With the billions of dollars and the 2 going on 3 years of a state of emergency around homelessness, where's the results? Where is it that we can look at that and say that that money has actually achieved enough of an impact given the scope and scale of how much we've invested? We've invested billions, and we have succeeded in housing a few thousand. It's not nothing. I'm grateful for progress. These issues take incremental steps, but we've declared it an emergency. We have made it the #1 priority. Oregonians have told us it's their #1 priority. I think the goal is too small. If we're declaring any form of victory with the modest gains that we have made, especially given the impacts on homeless youth in particular that are unique to Oregon relative to the rest of the nation, for how those numbers are playing out for unsheltered homeless youth in Oregon.
I think the results are that if we continue on the same track that we have been on for the last 2 years, by the end of June, we have created 4,800 new shelter beds, rehoused 3,300 households, and prevented 24,000 households from becoming evicted.
So we need
That
10
is
more
meaningful
years.
progress.
We
That is
need 10
meaning-
more years at that pace.
That is meaningful progress, and there's still more work to do. And I think that's a theme on many of the really large challenges that we face as a state that we're not going to solve overnight. The housing crisis. We've passed substantial policies investments over the last 8 years, and it takes time to be able to build more housing and have those investments come to fruition. But we have made progress on each of those fronts, and there's more work to do.
And
So I would welcome
yeah.
another question.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that we have made progress, but I would just like to say that I do think that Oregonians' expectations is that the progress is faster.
I don't think you're going to get a ton of relief, Speaker Fahey, because I kind of on this tip. We heard the governor say on Monday, keep following my lead. I mean, it's also the lead you have set in part of your legislation, keep doing what we're doing. We heard Leader Drazan be very critical of that. Are there ways that you think we need to meaningfully pivot on some education? I think you'll probably talk about the accountability, housing, and behavioral health, like pivot versus adding, expanding. And if so, what are those?
I would, if you want to talk about education, I think the piece on accountability and outcomes, there are proposals that we can take up, then that we will talk about this session, that look at the relationship around local control in this state. Historically, we have had a philosophy of local control in our education system in this state, and that's important. Local communities know what's best for their schools and their communities. But I think when you are talking about a district that is significantly underperforming, that their graduation rates are low, their absenteeism rates are high, their kids are not reading at grade level, if we're talking about one of the lowest performing districts in the state has an obligation to step up and intervene. And in some states, that looks like they're allowed to do state takeovers of districts. The research has shown that that's not effective. That's not a model that I think will work in Oregon. But we do have a program that we started in the Student Success Act where the State Department of Education can come in and offer pretty substantial technical assistance and additional resources to those most underperforming districts in the state. That program is voluntary. And I don't think that if we have the lowest performing district in the state, I don't think that they should be allowed to say, no, thank you, we don't need that extra help and extra resources. Yeah. That's a pretty significant pivot as it relates to how we think about accountability and local control.
Well, the governor is saying that too. Are there ways that you think you differ with the governor's approach, or I don't know?
Okay, that's a different question than
kind of
pivot from.
But she's saying, follow my lead, or let's do what we've been doing. And you're right, there's an education thing that she's also proposing. I just wonder if there's any disagreement in approach.
I am sure that there are areas where we will not see eye to eye with the governor and the legislative branch. That has historically been true, when Governor Kotek was speaker as well. And there are priorities that individual legislators are working on that are not sort of priorities that the executive branch shares. Leader Bowman, I don't know if you're...
So I want to answer the education question before we go on to Leader Bowman again. I think that challenge with the proposal that's out there around education right now is I think it's missing the point. I don't think that the state is knocking it out of the ballpark in a bunch of other issue areas, and then therefore the state's the right person to intervene in these districts that are failing. I believe very strongly that the challenge isn't that the bureaucracy is at the wrong level. I believe that the challenge is that we do not have the right focus for who our customer is and who we're serving. The student that is being failed is what's happening in that district. The district itself probably functions just fine and has teachers and has buildings and has systems and all those things. The student is not being served there. I believe that the pivot needs to be to take this system, this bureaucracy, and turn it on its head and stop serving the bureaucracy and the system and perpetuating more of the same and just moving responsibility to a different level of government, but to move responsibility to the extent as possible back to the student's family with supports from these larger education systems and with supports from counselors and teachers and greater partnerships. But that the pivot point shouldn't be from small government to big government. The pivot point should and could be from the school to the family and the student. I would go the other direction. I think we are both recognizing that the school isn't getting the job done. And I think the proposals that we've seen on the other side of the aisle would be, school's not getting the job done, we're gonna step in. And that is absolutely recognizing that there's a failure here. But I would suggest that if the school isn't getting the job done, that what we do is we give more control, autonomy, and agency to that individual student and their families in collaboration and coordination with resources to identify what they need, whatever that might be, intervention, summer school, tutoring, whatever that menu might look like. I think the focus needs to be that kid and not necessarily a new level of systems control.
Super interesting question. I agree with the speaker's comments. I actually think the pivot is happening. The pivot started in 2019. Student Success Act, Measure 98, Early Literacy Plan from last session, and Summer Learning. Those are all directed funding towards things we know are research-based and going to produce better outcomes for kids. That is a departure than the way that we funded education historically before that. Those are directed in very specific targeted areas, but I think that is the pivot. The pivot is, we know it works. There's extensive research and evidence in this country that suggests, for example, what is going to help a kid learn more effectively, and we just need to make sure that those practices are funded and implemented in all districts across the state.
But the challenge then, if the pivot's already happened since 2019, why are our numbers still so bad? Why is it that Oregon's still the last state in the nation to fully recover for learning loss from COVID? I mean, if what we did before is the right thing to keep doing, why isn't it working? That's my challenge.
I think some of the summer, obviously the summer learning and the early literacy investments are recent. And so it will take time to take effect, particularly early literacy. It's such a fundamental to how kids learn and how they perform academically over the course of their career that we know that it will take time. We knew that we were making investments in future generation and future performance with our schools when we made that investment. But I fully expect that it's the right thing to do. We're looking more, as Leader Bowman said, we're looking more at what are the research and evidence-based ways that we can make a difference here. And I'm sure there are other folks that would like to ask a question. I'm not moderating this.
I have more a kind of broad, big picture question. I heard this morning that there were around 5,000 bills that are now in the hopper for the session. And I know it's a long session, but we have seen in the past when there have been a large number of bills that the big issues get pushed to the end so as maybe not to drum up too much controversy early on in the session, get other stuff done. Are you prioritizing the same way? Are we going to see some of these big issues like the transportation package, like education funding come up earlier in the session? I guess, how do you decide which issues are going to come up when you've got this long session now to spread things out?
Yeah, I think it's a great question about session planning. And so one of the things I think you can expect to see is that we do hope to take up the Medicaid funding mechanism earlier in session than the end of session. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that it is a very important mechanism for us to draw down federal funding. And if we are able to get to renew that funding mechanism earlier in session, there's some additional federal funding that we think would come to this state. So our providers, our hospitals, other folks are feeling some sense of urgency to get that done sooner, in the first half, let's say, not in the first month. And I do expect the transportation package will take longer. We wrapped up the tour a couple of months ago. We ran some pretty extensive work groups over the last couple of months to make their suggestions about what the package should look like. And so we are in real time processing the thoughts of those work groups and working to develop a package, which will then need to be, worked through the legislative process and changed. So just a couple of keys into how the session might shape up. I'd also talk about the large number of bills. It is a challenge, I think, in managing the work of the legislative session. I have been vocal about the fact that I think that the legislature should consider bill limits in future sessions to be able to prioritize our work. Because right now, what is happening is that it's the chairs of committees or the chair or the speaker that are prioritizing that work. And if in other states, it is very common to have a limit on the number of bills that are introduced. And that helps both ensure that the time of the legislature is used wisely and that the voice of the minority is elevated as well. Because when we have thousands of bills, the chairs do not have time to hear or consider every issue.
As one lawmaker told me, there are not 5,000 new ideas.
So I appreciate that, and I am always sensitive to this idea of any limitations on ideas in the process. And I invite our Democrat chairs, and certainly in collaboration with their vice chairs, to work together to ensure that the work plans for those committees include voice for both the majority and the minority. And I know that those conversations have started, and we look forward to seeing how that progresses throughout this session. But the question of whether or not we limit ideas and limit access for Oregonians and constituents based on sort of an arbitrary number is something that I have concerns about. Whether or not those ideas necessarily make it through the process is different than whether or not you limit their access in the first place. How is it I'm more scheduled than you?
We prioritize journalists.
Nice play. Nice play.
Yeah. This just kind of actually has to do with what we were just talking about. We talk about this expansion of ideas. I did a word search for study in the bills. There's 550 of them. And that's a concern for a couple of reasons. But from a journalistic perspective, these are gut and stuff bills that you all are able to sort of shuttle ideas kind of under the radar. I've talked to lobbyists that are not pleased with the transparency of this practice. I am not pleased with the transparency of this practice. Is there something that can be done? It seems to have expanded over the years. I don't know that these bills are going anywhere. So why do we have, I think it's more like 2,500 bills, but why do we even have all these when 500 of them are nothing? How do you all look at this practice?
I mean, I will say I am a convert to what Speaker Fahey said on bill limits.
I'm slowly and surely converting my colleagues.
Why aren't we doing that then?
So
if I could finish.
Yeah, please.
I would just say most legislators are under a certain limit. There are some who exceed that limit dramatically. In terms of the placeholders issue, placeholders are a part of the process and have been part of the process for forever. It is an interesting question whether it's an expanded practice or not. But there are reasons later in a session where, for efficiency's sake, you don't need 4 vehicles when you can have one. Every bill should still go through a public hearing and have a work session, and it's got to go through both chambers. So there are safeguards built into it. I think the bigger problem is you have this enormous volume, some of which the people who have drafted the bill are explicit they don't really care about. They're not going to be working the bill. They don't really mind if it passes or not. And what we should also remember, every bill we request get drafted costs money. We're paying a bunch of attorneys.
LC is not happy about.
And LFO and
I'd love to
others.
answer the question about the study bills. Because it really does lend itself to a larger conversation about how transparent is our process, exactly how much of the Oregon way have we continued to preserve in the state of Oregon. And I would say that when you see however many, 500, 200, however many study bills we have, it really is an expression of this idea that the people in power want to have maximum flexibility for the last possible minute to do whatever it is they need to do to be able to hit their agenda. And And I don't think that that is great for Oregonians themselves. I think that having a process that's authentic, even if it has to be slow, is better than having a process which is efficient and might leave out the possibility that people that are impacted and stakeholders that are adversely impacted in particular have enough time and ability to be able to engage on that issue. I think we don't get as good a public policy when we move things late and when we move things at the last minute, and the opportunity to really plan and really look at things and give it the rigor that this process can allow for when we choose to is really the high standard. It really is the gold standard for how you legislate across the nation. And I think that this idea that we have so many gut and stuff bills isn't necessarily best practice.
So there are a couple of pieces I want to respond to. One, I think I heard some questions about, is there a bill about bill limits? That is something that would be in our rules. And if we want to institute it for, say, the 2027 session, we would need to pass that in our rules in the short session next year. So we have time to talk about it. I have time to convince more people to my side. And then specifically on the study bills and transparency, it is so important that we have a transparent process that the public can participate in this building. Every bill has notice requirements before public hearings and before work sessions, and we accept testimony after the hearings are closed. We've expanded the opportunities for Oregonians to participate in this building, to give testimony remotely, for example. And so that piece is very important. And I also think the other aspect of transparency that is critical for me is running processes leading up to the session that are open and transparent and where all the perspectives are represented at the table. On the transportation package, I would say, we did a statewide tour. We had 3 work groups do some pretty intensive work on 3 different topics as it relates to the transportation package. And my commitment, because it is such a big piece of legislation where we're going to talk about revenue and expenditures and accountability, was that I wanted to run a very open and transparent process on that, and not have people, 4 people making the decision in the basement of the Capitol.
But the way the timing has played out,
the
way the timing has played out has been, that we did all of that process with no package for people to talk about. And so, yes, I love process, it's valuable, but if people don't know what they are considering, is that really authentic engagement? So we're talking about the possibility of raising $2 to $3 billion in new taxes and revenues in this session, and we don't even know what it looks like. It's hard to know which people need to engage. It's hard to know which particular stakeholders should be at the table that are affected by that if they don't even know what the proposal is yet. And so I think that part of it is tricky, that there's value in a transparent process, there's value in crossing the state, there's value in convening, but there's greater value when there's something specific for them to look at and talk about and discuss, and I think that part of it we haven't seen yet.
Yep, that's what the legislative session is for.
That's why we're here.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
I don't know, did you want us to stick around, or?
Time for one more. I have a follow-up to that, if that's okay.
Sure,
I know the
yeah,
rules
of course.
conditioning is not okay.
Yep. I see Senate President Wagner in the back of the room, so. Yeah, I would like to call on you.
It's a quick one, but I've seen bills here, and just in follow-up to what you guys were talking about, I've seen bills here go through closed caucus and be completely transformed without any transparency as to who voted on what. I know that closed caucus is a thing in a lot of states, but I mean, these are major bills like the tenant protection bill that all of a sudden gets majorly watered down and no one has any idea who the vote was that didn't want it to pass the way it was. So I think in terms of transparency there's something to be said about that as well.
Well, every bill, as I said, every bill has a public hearing, and the amendments, if there's an amendment to the bill, you know who votes on it and who votes against it in the committee. So, I appreciate, lawmakers are going to have conversations amongst themselves, obviously not in a quorum kind of setting, about what they think the right direction to send a bill, where a bill should go. So I'm not.
No, I think that's right. Every vote that every legislator takes is on the record in committee and on the floor. And we hear from our constituents based on those votes. So that's the practice.
It does seem that a lot of that is decided behind closed doors, though. Like ahead of time, everyone votes the way the caucus had decided they were going to vote on those amendments that then get taken up and people have very little idea why.
I mean, there were several examples from the last session where, a lot of examples actually, where it wasn't all a party line vote or some Democrats voted differently. There's also vote explanations that get filed when legislators want to explain why they've voted the way that they have. But I also think it is true, very rarely am I coming to the floor with no idea how I'm going to vote on something. I'm trying to come having done my research, reached out to stakeholders, read the materials when possible, to try to be as informed as possible.
I guess one thing that I want to say about this session, this isn't a criticism in any way, shape, or form. These are a lot of inside baseball questions about how the legislature operates, and they're fair game. We're happy to talk about the process and transparency and how things work. And I think what Oregonians really want from us is to actually deliver on the meaningful challenges that we have laid out. So affordability, public safety, accountability in government. So I sometimes struggle between, even on the accountability work, it's sort of like how to talk at the nitty-gritty details of what we really mean in a concrete basis. Oregonians want their government to be accountable, but they also want to be able to afford housing. And so I do try to talk about what is the issues, what are the work that we're trying to do, and what are we trying to accomplish at the end of the day. I appreciate the conversation about process, and I'm always happy to talk about that too. But for me, just from a personal level, I think I'm a very policy-oriented person, so I like to dig into policy-oriented questions too.
Thank you both.
Thanks, yeah.
I hope you saved your hardest questions for the Senate.
Right.
They can handle it.
Julia, thanks first to you and the Capitol Press Corps. Someday, hopefully soon, I don't know, we will get this beautiful edifice all finished and the concourse level will be complete and there'll be a wonderful, amazing newsroom coming to you in 2029. I was looking at Dirk for that one.
I have some renovation ideas.
Really? Where are we going to put them?
Yeah.
Okay. But thank you so much. I know that you're probably gassed. It's been a long week. Y'all are just like us trying to get our sea legs a little bit underneath us as we're getting back into the habit of being here. And so I'll keep my comments pretty brief. I guess for your record, Rob Wagner, I'm the State Senate President. I represent Senate District 19, which is all three metro area counties of Washington, Clackamas, and Multnomah, cities in kind of the southwest suburbs, and a little bit of southwest Portland, and have the opportunity to serve as Senate President again for a couple years, which is a heck of an honor. You've probably heard a lot about kind of policy overview, and I'll probably turn it over to our majority leader to kind of talk through a little bit of the caucus. So I want to talk about just maybe really high level the what, and then spend just a really brief amount of time on the how. And the what coming into this legislative session, I think you'll see, there's going to be a lot of consistency on the things that we're hearing from our constituents across the state are the issues that they want us tackling and dealing with. It's a continuation. I'm sure you've probably heard this around housing and homelessness and addiction, following up on our promises of what we've made and the progress we've made in that direction. Transportation is going to be a huge focus for us. We know from the work that we did going all around the state to 12 different locations and work groups and coming in and the attention that we've put in, it's time that we look at having a safe and stable transportation system that works for all Oregonians across the state in all the ways that they need it to work, and bringing it in with accountability and making sure that we're holding a state agency accountable for the resources that we're giving them. So that's going to be a big focus. I think you'll hear, and again, I came in, sorry, I've got like hand sanitizer and stuff. I'm just getting over the Capitol cred, but on the Medicaid match program that our state is really dependent on. Half of the kids in the state of Oregon get access to their health care through the Oregon Health Plan. And so we know that we need to make sure that we're meeting our obligation. I think there'll be some early attention. That's been a really big bipartisan focus in the past, and that's our intention this session too. So we'll talk more healthcare, education. I would say wildfire, the work that we did coming out of trying to find common solutions, bringing people together, trying to listen to communities around wildfire response and community safety. And then before I turn it over to Leader Bonham, I would say, and for those that heard me on Monday, I want to be consistent on this. The how, for me, matters almost as much as the what. And I think that we have an obligation to the voters and the constituencies of Oregon to come into this building and model our behavior that sets us up for success and what they expect out of their state government. And I think that means that we need to be approaching this work with a level of expectation for people that are committee chairs or people that are advocates that bring the opportunity for every voice to be brought forward, to be able to be authentically engaged and heard. So I can talk more about that and just on the thoughts on some of it. I think there's that, and I also think that we see a lot of rhetoric coming around our political discourse across the country. A lot of it I don't think is very healthy. I don't think it's healthy for our republic. I don't think it's healthy for our democracy, and this is something that I've spent a lot of time coming out of the 23 session on trying to really understand this role and how to build relationships and the critical nature of getting our members, especially in a post-COVID, post-construction environment, getting to know each other and trying to figure out how to work across party line with each other, and at minimum have a fundamental level of respect and an authentic engagement and understanding that people can come at issues differently and that it's okay to have a different ideology approaching the space, and that doesn't make them a suspect human being. That just means that they're bringing the voices of their constituents and what they're hearing from their community forward, and that should be respected in this process. So I'll turn it over to Senator Bonham, and then I guess we'll go to Kayse after that.
Okay. Daniel Bonham, State Senator. Home is the Dalles. My district literally is the Dalles, is the far eastern point, and comes back over Hood River County, East Clackamas, East Multnomah County. If you're farming in Multnomah County, you're my constituent. I think that's a fair way of describing it.
He might debate you on that.
Yeah, fair enough. But we all represent about 140,000 people. And we come here to Salem with those people in mind and a mission to try and make Oregon a place where they want to live, where they can thrive, where they can self-sustain their family and their future. And one of the things the Republican Party in the Senate is trying to do is to affect positive change. We're not here to be a speed bump. We're not here to be bypassed or alienated or obscured in any way, but we're coming here to participate. We have bills, we have ideas, we have criticism. So coming off of a campaign season, I think is always fascinating. We're coming into the building having just heard from a lot of people. We still do retail politics. We still go door to door. We do town halls, we do coffee gatherings, and people very consistently told us what was on their mind. They said affordability is a huge problem, and it's getting worse. Housing affordability continues to be top of mind for most of my constituents, grandparents, parents saying, I don't know where the future generation is going to live. Do I have to remodel my home to make space for them to come back someday? It's a real concern. Average cost of housing is through the roof. I think we're up to $520,000, about an average cost of a home that's on the market today, statewide. 31% higher cost of living than the national average here in Oregon. These are genuine concerns that people have, and I think they expect us to do what they're doing, to live within their means. The legislature, you heard from Leader Drazan. I was watching the House presentation, and she adequately said, from 2013-15 budget to last biennial budget, the state doubled its budget from $62 to $124 billion. Billion dollars is a lot of money. 1,000 million. I say this all the time to people back home. To put it into context, 1 million seconds is 11.8 days. 1 billion seconds is 31 and a half years. This is a massive amount of money that we have. And this year, the governor's projected budget was 137. We got a new state economist that's trying to capture all the money, so there will be no kicker, so we don't need to fight about a kicker, perhaps, because we're going to just project more revenue than potentially we'll gather. But that's a lot of money, a $13 billion increase over the previous biennial budget. And I'll rat myself out. The governor didn't name me earlier. She said, I'm hearing from legislators that we can use general fund to pay for stuff. specifically transportation? Absolutely we can. Budgets express priorities. That money's available to us. We don't need a new tax when we have money in the coffers. Now, surely, I understand the governor's perspective as somebody that believes that growing government is a good thing and the government can be everything to everybody, that she wants that general fund money to do other things because it's the most fungible money. You can do more with general fund than you can with federal dollars that are drawn down for a very specific purpose. That said, we can make the choice as a legislature to say we understand the plight of the working people. I watched some Democrat colleagues during the campaign season run ads where they had third-party people say, hey, this senator understands the plight of the working people and will go to Salem and fight against new taxes. I have some Democrat allies apparently in the Senate. I'm excited to work with them on holding back and reining in any potential revenue growth. So there's a lot we can do. I really do appreciate Senate President Wagner making a lot of time to try and get to know our caucus members. He really has invested energy and effort to get around the state. His mission, unlike some of the others that were mentioned, the governor mentioned going statewide. I know she came to my communities and she specifically met with her friends. She didn't come and meet with people that didn't share her ideals. She specifically scheduled meetings with housing folks and people that are pro-labor union. Like, she met with her friends. So she didn't get a good picture as to what living in Eastern Oregon necessarily was. She got to know what perspectives of people that already support her are within my community. Rob Wagner went statewide and said, let me meet your family, let me meet your friends, let's sit down and have a meal. Let me listen to a podcast with your grandmother. It is one of my favorite things. He listens to a lot of podcasts. I look forward to creating more content for him to listen to on his drive down.
You guys remember?
But
he did a great podcast.
Yeah. But the statewide tours, the transportation statewide tour went out with no proposal. We didn't tell people what we were doing. We just said, come talk to us about transportation. We think we've got a big budget hole. Come talk to us. So we heard from local jurisdictions saying, we've got budget holes too. And we heard from public transit people who were the only people that organized it and said, make sure we get some people out to these meetings. And they said, I love a free ride to the airport where I don't have to pay for parking. But realistically, again, coming out of a campaign cycle, people at the doors were saying, please, God, don't tax me. I can barely afford what my cost of living is today. New taxes, increased taxes are going to cause me to go backwards. And I just can't, flat out can't afford it. So I do appreciate the energy and the effort. 2023 was tough. Longest walkout in recorded history in the state of Oregon, resulted in 10 of us being not eligible to run for office again. And, I think we're making strides. I think we're trying to find common ground. We're trying to invest in relationship. Our commitment from a Republican caucus level to our Democrat colleagues is that we want to engage in the same way. We're coming with a charm offensive. We want to get to know you. We want to go out to dinner with you. Axe throwing was mentioned in the speech. I think that's a great idea. Maybe some cornhole, who knows? But I do think we need to get to know each other. I think the opportunity to build bridges, again, I think when the folks from the House were speaking earlier, there's a lot in common under our identified problems, and now we just need to coalesce around how we can work towards solutions that work for all Oregonians.
Well, with that said, good afternoon, everyone. Senator Kayse Jama, District 24, House Senate Majority Leader. I think, first of all, let me thank the press corps for your work and reporting what we care most and the work that we do. And not only do you report what we do, but also you are the voice of the Oregonians, and you amplify their voices and issues that matters to them. With that said, I think this is really going to be some challenging session. Oregonians are struggling in terms of the cost of living increases, inflation, housing. The struggle is real. So I think for us, our role is this coming session is going to be, how do we make sure that we uplift the Oregonians, regardless of where they are from the state, to ensure that they have what they need to support their families, and how do we make sure that the process that we're creating works all Oregonians. I think Oregonians are expecting the leaders from this body to work together to ensure that everybody's ideas matters, every person has their voice heard, and all Oregonians, regardless of where they are, feels like they be represented. That is the synergy that we're hoping to work on this coming session. But going back to the agenda, I think you have a copy about things that we shared with you about Oregon Forward agenda. I think that's the model that Democrats are going with in terms of what it contains. There's 3 goals that we want to achieve this coming session. Goal 1, increasing prosperity for all Oregonians, regardless of where they reside in Oregon. Number 2, making Oregon safer and healthier. Number 3, protecting our rights and freedoms. If the reality is that the status quo is not working for all Oregonians, and we have to make sure that we address some of those goals and address them how we can effectively put a solution forward together as a collective body. As a position of majority, I'm new to this role, as you all might know it. And really my goal again is to be the voice of all Oregonians, but also the voice of the work with my Democratic colleagues to ensure that I represent them in terms of the best that I can, but also understand that also we have a collaboration and partnership with our Republican colleagues and open that collaboration in a ways that creates a synergy among all of us. Regardless of that, we're all representing our constituency and our support. So that's really what I'm hoping to focus the energy that I'm going to with that. In terms of the 3 areas that are goals that I mentioned, increasing prosperity, what that means for us, focusing on affordability and economic opportunity, expanding affordable housing. I think there has been a lot of discussion earlier about affordable housing. And for me, there's 4 goals that we have to really think about it as we address affordable housing issues. Number 1, first of all, acknowledging that this issue has been an ongoing issue for decades. We have been underbuilding for decades, and we have to acknowledge that this is really, we're trying to catch up. Goal 1, first of all, about housing. How do we make sure that we don't expand houselessness in our community? How do we prevent houselessness in our community? That's really goal 1. And what that means is that ensuring that we have expanded shelter beds, making sure that all Oregonians have a transitional housing, as well as ensuring that we make sure that there is a potential increasing affordable housing. I think you heard about Speaker Fahey talking about that, the numbers that we created. Goal 2 in some of the housing, then when somebody becomes homeless, what do we do with them? While we also, ultimate goal is to make sure that they move into the permanent housing, there has to be some sort of a transition to ensure that they have a place to put the bed that they need for night to spend for night for shelter, and making sure that there is a shelter availability across the state, regardless of what area in the state. Goal 3, how do we make sure that we increase housing production? And again, I want to emphasize that housing production. We did some great work last session, and those work is going to be in the pipeline in the future. So there is more work to be done, of course, but there is really some great work that's been done. Number 4, final area of we need to pay attention to housing around is to make sure we create opportunity Oregonians who want to own their own housing, that they have the opportunity to own it. I personally experienced that as someone who's also come from low-income background in the back days in my life, and making sure that Oregonians have the ability to buy their own homes. In terms of the other issues that we want to make sure the economic opportunity, increasing prosperity for Oregon, is that we want to make sure that people get new jobs, workforce development, those kind of workforce development that partnerships, and those are the areas that we want to make sure that we have to ensure that there is an opportunity for Oregonians to get the training that they need to get the jobs, livable wage jobs that they have. In terms of the other areas that we want to talk about is that making Oregon safer. We must address crime and enhance community safety and improve law enforcement practices, invest to improve community health, address root cause of the issues. So not only do we supporting our local law enforcement, but also we want to make sure that we have systems that's accountable to all Oregonians. Building transformative transportation is going to be a key investment that we need to invest in this upcoming session. In terms of the last agenda item that I'm going to cover is that rights and freedoms of all Oregonians. I think there's no question about in my mind that we're going to create here from chaos and confusion in Washington, D.C. So how do we make sure that Oregonians' rights and freedoms are protected? Oregonians cherish their freedom and rights. So we want to make sure that we protect Oregonians from their rights, and that includes immigrant refugees, LGBTQ community members, reproductive rights. Those are the issues that we want to make sure that we protect from Oregonians, from government reaching out, overreach. That's some of the 4 key area elements that we're going to be focusing. I know I've been speaking a lot. I'm going to stop there and just engage with you folks in terms of Q&A, but I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you about what the Democratic Caucus members are really looking forward to be accomplished in this 2025 session while collaborating our Republican colleagues as well. So thank you so much.
Afternoon. Hi. So each of you spoke about that many Oregonians are obviously facing the rising cost of living and housing right now, and specifically when it comes to the transportation package, a lot of people are saying that that package might involve new taxes or fees or changes to the way that the state funds, that we fund this system. I guess what gives you confidence, and how confident are you that lawmakers are going to be able to reach an agreement around a transportation package this session, just given those rising costs and the sheer amount of money that transportation agencies are saying that they would need right now?
Yeah, well, I would say what's past is prologue a little bit. We've set ourselves up with the State Highway Trust Fund for 100 years. I mean, you can go back to the beginning of the internal combustion engine and look at how we started to fund transportation needs in the state of Oregon. We are forecasting living in a very different future in terms of the types of cars that are on the road, the fuel efficiency of those cars, regardless of what's going to happen out of sort of the federal government and vehicle efficiency standards. So we know that our dependence on gas tax revenue is going to go away. And historically in the legislature, we were able to come together. In the time that I've been here, I go back to the late 90s, but in 2007 and 2017, people were able to do what we've done up to this point, which is go and collect input from people and come together. I do think that it'll probably be an area where there'll be some debate and disagreement, potentially given where we've already had conversation around the utilization of general fund versus looking at a stable future revenue system that is going to fund the basics of a transportation system for what Oregonians need, and again, at all 4 corners of Oregon. I had an opportunity to go to Tillamook. I did the Portland tour. I was out in Clackamas County, for the Transportation Roadshow. I know actually there was an article, I think the Oregonian wrote, about the bridge that went between Senator Gorsuch's district and Senator Bonham's district this last week that just crumbled. And so this isn't a hypothetical that you're seeing. It's something that people are living with every single day. And I think people are expecting us to step up, the legislature coming together and trying to advance a package. I do think that, and I don't want to preempt my friend's comments, but on the utilization of general fund, I think that's not a place that we'll end up getting, because the demands that are coming at us with federal funds going away, kind of in this post-COVID environment, we hear it from when you go back out in our local communities, people's access to healthcare and education, the other needs that we have that come through our state. I think having transportation being out there as a package and looking at revenue that's going to match what our basic needs are to be able to fund a safe, efficient, and stable system, I think that's what we're going to be looking at advancing this session. I didn't mean to jump in over the top of you.
You're fine.
Okay. Yeah. Do you want to get in here too? Do you want me to speak for you?
Oh, I'm nervous about filibustering on this question, because there's so many topics, there's so many directions to go with it. First and foremost, what could be proposed new taxes? We were informed today that most likely there will be a draft of what's coming February 14th through the Joint Transportation Committee. So February 14th, we can all look forward to finding out what potential tax framework there will be for this new model. If you look at many other states, I think it's about half of states in this nation use some form of general fund contribution to their transportation system funding. So, that's certainly not unprecedented. It's certainly not out of the norm. And yet, we're pretty consistent so far from the governor and now the Senate president. That's probably not something that the majority party wants to consider. So I've seen some preliminary numbers from them about what could be revenue streams that could raise. I've got 250 annual, 500 annual, $1 billion annual, 1.5 billion annual. And, so what number are we targeting to begin with? Originally, I think if you looked at the last session, in 2024, there was a TED subcommittee, Transportation Economic Development Subcommittee, where ODOT came forward and they said, that they were $3.4 billion, $1.7 billion per year short of maintaining current service level. They went out on this roadshow, they kept using that number. I kept saying, what's the real number? Like, I know sometimes we shoot high hoping to get half. And interestingly, they came back at the beginning of this year and they said, hey, the real number is 1.75 billion. You're welcome. We cut it in half. Which only begs the question, is the 6.3 baseline budget that you have able to face the same scrutiny? Are there cuts to be made there? Are we getting what we paid for? If you look back at 2017, it was a fight to get legislators to agree to 10-cent fuel tax, 0.1% employment tax to fund statewide transit. That was a fight to get the votes to get there. And yet the deliverables still aren't there. We don't have expansion of the Rose Quarter. The Abernathy Bridge isn't constructed. The roundabout coming out of Crooked River Ranch into Terrebonne never happened. So, there were projects that were committed statewide that still have not been completed. And so we're going to ask for more taxes. We're going to ask for more revenue. To what end? To new capacity? Or is it just to maintain current service level? Because that's what they told us the 3.4 billion was to begin with. Now 1.75 is just to maintain service level. That's not to add capacity. So it is something that this is going to be a big conversation. And I'm nervous because of, some things, Senate rules. I was looking at Senate Rule 1311. We have confidentially within the framework of an individual member have confidentiality with LC. We've asked for a copy of whatever they're working on, this working draft. This is a joint committee. Joint committees, according to Senate rules, don't conform to that confidentiality requirement. And so we've asked LC for a copy of whatever they're working on. And if they don't have a draft, what did the Joint Ways and Means Committee chairs ask for? So we talked about transparency, we talked about good government, we talked about accountability, and here we are, we're asking, and LC says, you can't get that from us, but you can get it from LPRO. And LPRO says, well, that's something you're supposed to get from LC. So I'm begging for help. We want to know what's coming before February 14th. We want to be prepared to hit the ground running. We don't want to be surprised. So here we are asking to accommodate a Senate rule that exists that should, again, help and aid in our ability to participate in this conversation, because we have not, as Republicans, been involved in developing anything framework around what taxes could look like.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. So on this handout, it talks about increasing access to care for all Oregonians. And there's a line in there that says safeguarding every Oregonian's right to reproductive care and abortion. I want to find if there's going to be specific bills or legislation about that. And I just want to hear just more specifics about just what's going on with healthcare.
Well, thank you for the question. I think Oregonians know that we have done a lot of work in this area for the last few sessions. I think, we passed the reproductive health bill in last session. But I think ultimately the goal is actually to ensure that all Oregonians have access to the healthcare that they deserve and they can make their own choices. I'm not going to go to the specifics of any particular bill, but I think we will be addressing some of those issues in a ways that helps the Oregonians to make their own personal choices and where they can get the care that they need the most.
Okay. Can you offer any other specifics about just the healthcare, like any big priorities as far as healthcare?
I think, again, I don't want to get ahead of myself. The important issue is going to be, again, the accessibility of healthcare, and that's really what we're going to focus in terms of this coming session. And so I'm not going to go to the specific bills because I think we just received the 2,500 bills, so we haven't gone through every single bill. But I think the sentiment that I'm sharing with you is that we will be addressing some of those concerns that Oregonians are facing, the cost of the healthcare, to make sure Oregonians have access to healthcare, and then make sure that Oregonians have the right to choose how they're going to get their healthcare, receive their healthcare. So those are the common themes, but I think I'm not going to go to the specifics in terms of the particular bill.
Okay. I said one follow-up. Senator Bonham, I'd be on the Medicaid match. It sounds like there is a tax that needs to be renewed. I just want to get a sense from your side where you stand with that. If there's any concerns about the mechanism for funding Medicaid, or.
Well, I'll say this: I don't believe in taxing healthcare as a blanket statement. I'm struggling right now as a member of the minority party that doesn't feel included to want to participate, especially when we have members of Democrat leadership in the House saying that they're willing to go it alone, that they're interested in going it alone, that they're going to bypass any Republican feedback and pass taxes without us. I think that is just an absolute terrible approach to this conversation. I think ultimately our desire is to work together. It is our desire. What I don't want to see is what happened in 2023, where we address bipartisan topics early and come with hyperpartisan things late. So I hope that if we're going to talk about the provider tax, for example, that it's part of a global strategic endeavor session-wide, as opposed to trying to get a win early and then pivot to something else. I do want to go back to the question you asked Senator Jama about access. It's super important to us in rural Oregon. People in Eastern Oregon have limited access, a lot of times having to drive 30, 45 hour plus to get to the nearest provider, nearest hospital. And our rural hospitals right now, because of Medicaid reimbursement rates, because of Medicare reimbursement rates, are struggling to survive. I just had a conversation yesterday with our OB department, my local hospital, and we lose $17,000 per birth in our hospital. And you can only do that so long before the hospital says, we can't provide this service. We can't bleed in this one area. We need to find a way to make money. And the reality is the private insurers are spending $31,000 more than cost on that same birth. So on average, to lose $17,000 tells you that we've got a serious issue that needs to be resolved. I don't think we want to lose capacity or access in most parts of the state. So reimbursement rates are super important to us. There is a bill that I was just reading again before coming down here where we're picking and choosing winners, though, where we're going to give certain care providers 100% of the average rate of the commercial ratepayers, and then we're going to give other providers 150% of the average rate of those rate. Like, who's coming up with these numbers? And why are we not having a very consistent approach across the board to this? Why are we even talking about eliminating any investment from healthcare? I get bifurcating that I don't want BlackRock or Amazon to decide whether or not my 84-year-old mom gets a new hip, but simultaneously, I do want private investment in healthcare. We need as many dollars coming into the system as possible because the pie's not growing. And what we're doing with some of these ideas and concepts is we're just dividing up the pie and we're picking winners and losers. That's a challenge for those of us that feel like we're on the losing end of a lot of these conversations.
So do you support raising Medicaid rates for hospitals, or are you in favor of that?
I think we need to have a very serious discussion.
Okay.
Just real quickly on this too, I think there is a timing issue, and I'll follow back up with you on this because I don't want to get too far out over my skis. But I do think if this gets posted and goes early, I think that's pretty typical. I think there's a timing issue out of the federal government too. So I'm looking back for a phone my friend here in the back, but
Stephen's nodding.
Yeah, okay, Stephen's nodding. So my understanding is in order to bring, to be able to capture the match that we need under the existing federal Medicaid program, that there is some expediency that we actually need to move legislation. So I think we're going to be front loading those conversations earlier in session and trying to get something, that's through. And again, this stated intention is to get everybody around the table and try to get it similar to what we've had in the past, to get a bipartisan vote out of this. So, but I'm happy to follow, work with our policy people to follow up with you on that as well.
So Senator Jama, you mentioned at the end of your opening remarks that there's things that you and Senate Democrats want to do to safeguard Oregonians' rights, given the new administration coming in on Monday. I want to know specifically from you what there is left to do that Oregon didn't already do during his first term. And then from Senator Bonham, I'd love to hear your response to this idea that a lot of our state agencies, state legislators are looking for ways to stymie a president whose inauguration you're attending.
Let me just push away from the table.
Thank you for the
Can I get you
question.
a cup of water?
I think it's a really important question. So let me say a couple of things. One, first of all, we really don't know what is in the pipeline. I think we have some ideas what the administration said that they were planning to do. So with that said, I think some of those things, example of about immigration, about healthcare related issues, those are the things that we know that folks said that they will do it. So I think the question for us will be, how do we prepare for that in terms of and making sure that our Attorney General is taking the lead in terms of that protection and making sure the Oregonians are feeling their rights and values are being protected. Those are a couple examples, but I think ultimately what we care about Oregon is to ensure that Oregonians, there is a homegrown issues that we have to address as legislators. That's our priority, but make no mistake, we will make sure that Oregonians' rights and freedoms are protected, and we will see what the actions that the administration takes, and we'll act accordingly in that scenario.
So I rewind to the Dobbs decision coming down, and I remember my friend Speaker Fahey was then Majority Leader, and immediately she put out a press release and said, "Fear not, we've resolved this here in Oregon. We knew that this was coming, and we have codified this into statute. We have protected your rights." And then a few months later, it was campaign season, and it was, oh my gosh, fear every Republican, they're coming after this right. They're going to take away your fundamental right to reproductive rights, AKA having an abortion, and live in fear. Don't let them have control. I feel like this is settled law in Oregon. Like, as much as I personally am pro-life, this has been settled law. And so I feel like this approach to push back against Trump is that campaign side. Like, I feel like, to your point of the question, like this, we've codified in Oregon the things that Oregonians expect us to have in law. And the threat from the federal government is a little bit of an empty threat. Like, I don't believe there's a there. I do believe that President Trump's going to do the things he talked about. I think he's going to spur an economic engine and revitalize investment, repatriate dollars from overseas and bring manufacturing back. I think you're going to see an energy race that's going to force us into a position of energy independence. And I would hope that Oregon would lean into that. The arguments we've been making here in Oregon as Republicans for the last 7 years that I've been here have been to quit regulating and overburdening business. Invite that business here to where we already have a relatively restrictive regulatory framework that keeps emissions down, for example. Send them to Texas, send them to China. The goods are still going to be produced. Why would you want them in a jurisdiction where they can pollute more? Invite them here. Make Oregon attractive enough to where we can have those jobs, that investment. I've been stuck on the budget for a while now. I've been looking at what is the economic engine of different states, what's their population, how much are they spending. Colorado produces like $400 billion of GDP. Oregon's at like 270, 280. They have 7 million people. We have 4.2 million. Arizona is kind of roughly the same numbers, and yet their budgets are smaller than ours. And I wish we could just get out of the way of business and industry to a certain extent that Oregonians would be comfortable with, and allow that prosperity to feed a system, give people more money, have better jobs, and we start to solve some of these other problems that we're talking about. But again, to then pretend like somehow the boogeyman is Donald Trump and he's coming for us, I'm not sold on that.
It feels like leadership is in a good place right now, at least if you guys are being honest.
Ouch.
You know, in sessions past, one of the platform planks from Dems has been public safety via gun restrictions. I did notice at least 3 bills on the Senate side specifically. I haven't got through all the House bills. Thank you for being more restrained than them on this. And so I just wonder from you all, that is the type of thing, almost regardless, that's gonna get temperatures up and lead to some clashes. But that doesn't mean you guys are serious about bringing that forward. Maybe you are. Maybe those are just things that have been proposed, but they're maybe not going to get a lot of attention. How are the Democrats thinking about it?
On
guns. Yeah, I mean, there's a bump stock bill. I think there's something to limit people's
gun safety,
limit people's access under 21.
Yeah. So take it from someone, and we obviously represent very different constituencies depending on where you go. I come out of a community that has probably the strongest moms demand action, group. When I came into the legislature, it was right after Parkland, and I remember Rep. Salinas and I came in, and there were 300 kids that were flooding the then rotunda and were saying, "How come you're not doing something?" And so, I said, I'm going to give you the ability to write any bill you want, right? Rookie mistake, and gave them the keys to legislative council and dropped a bill that had 10 planks to it. And I think people are still probably laughing about this effort of this legislation we introduced. My lesson and reason for saying that is I think, and then this last legislative session, I really took a lot of pride and ownership in passing the legislation that sets up a task force to look at community safety, sensible gun safety, and suicide, because I'm trying to get people together around the table that want to talk about what the intention of legislation is, and that is to save lives. And it's not just to go reach out and take somebody's firearm because that's the way you think that you're going to save lives. I think there needs to be something that's evidence proven in this debate. I've learned a lot in that space. I have not had direct conversation with all the different people and all the different ideas around the firearms, gun control, gun safety kind of space. And so honestly, Dirk, I mean,
I'm not, these ideas. I mean, they were part
very
of the
familiar.
2023 walkout. They were negotiated away. You have engaged with these ideas. Yes, I'm confident.
Absolutely. There's a lot of ideas, and we have a lot more conversation to figure it out. I will flat out tell you there isn't a sense that we're coming in and going, here's the package of gun control bills that we're going to pass this legislative session, heck to the hindmost, get out of our way. That's not the way that I'm walking into this building right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We just heard from your colleagues in the House, particularly the Democrats, but also from Leader Drazan about the need for state lawmakers to perhaps have a bigger accountability role over the agencies. I'm curious if the Senate is also discussing that and how you see that accountability role.
I'll say something and then try to pull multiple voices in here. Having been around the legislature for half of my life, and now I've got increasingly growing gray hairs popping out of the side of my temples. It's been, there's been sort of fits and starts, I think, in terms of the legislature's role around looking at agency accountability, even from the time that I've been here. And I hearken back to 2009 session, and there was legislation that was chief co-sponsored by Tobias Reed and Kim Thatcher that established a website on government transparency. And so, just anybody's sitting there on OLS right now looking this up. But I mean, that was when, iPhones, we had Blackberries or pagers, and the idea that somehow the legislature has an appropriate function to be able to ask tough questions of state agencies on the tax dollars that people send us into this building and how they're being spent. And I think we also have a responsibility to look back at the volume of legislation that we've passed and ask questions on whether or not, when it's getting out there and it's actually impacting the lives of Oregonians, are these policies working? And so I don't have a preset, here's a bill that we're going to do. I am committed, and I haven't had the opportunity directly to engage. Apparently, there's a work group that's been happening on the House side. My understanding is that's been sort of very House-driven conversation. I look forward to the opportunity engaging some of those thoughts and how we can do things. I don't think it's necessarily something you have to do through legislation, but I'm committed because I think it's an important role of the legislature to come in and provide agency accountability and to make sure that people know that their tax dollars are being spent wisely. So I actually am going to, and I said this on Monday, ask our chairs to be working, and I'll be working with the Republican leader as well on how can we have conversations to make sure our committees are giving adequate time to be able to bring people in to ask questions about legislation we've passed and the budgets that we've passed and where that money is going.
I think just quickly adding to that, I think President Wagner really highlighted what I was about to say, which is really around accountability is really important to all of us. And so one of the things that I can share with you is that last few interim time, a lot of the informational hearing, we spend a lot of energy around bringing the agencies and making sure, like, especially like when I was at the housing chair, we invited the agencies to come to in front of us and really, tell us their progress in terms of what the resources that we give them and how they're spending their resources and their accountability, measurable accountability that we put them forward for them, and whether they're making the benchmarks that we set them for them. Those are really most of the chairs, as far as I know, that has been doing the similar way of holding accountability with the agencies. So that's kind of what I want to share with you in terms of but again, it's really important that we make sure that there's accountability, how Oregonians are expecting us to do accountability in terms of how dollars have been spent.
I think the reality of accountability is it has to be driven by the majority party. And I don't say that to make excuses for the minority party, but I've been in committees where I wanted to ask direct questions and have been gavelled down by the chair of the committee saying we didn't bring the agency forward to embarrass them or ask them difficult questions. Okay, well, I respect the chair. They've got that right and authority to control the environment of a committee, but there were real questions that needed to be asked to the employment department coming out of COVID as to why nobody was getting their benefits. And if not in this format where the public can witness some, I thought, thoughtful questions about what do we need to do. And I do think that's the challenge, right? We have been in the Senate Republican office bringing in agencies kind of one at a time to introduce our policy staff to the people that actually do the work. And we've developed a rapport, and a lot of it comes down to confidentiality, right? Like, I didn't bring you before me so that I could embarrass you 30 seconds later by calling one of you folks and saying, did you have any idea the agency was doing this? But I actually want you to be successful. I don't always agree with what the legislature has told you to do, but we have put forward mandates, and what have we told you that was a bad idea? What have we told you that's costing you a lot of money? What are the things that we can do to come arm in arm with you and help you lead? It was unfortunate, that Cal Makamoto was in a position to be, forced into a position where he felt the political pressure to resign. I think Cal was a victim of a lot of circumstance. Ultimately, I did at the end think, okay, he's a distraction. He probably needs to move on so that the agency can just heal and we can get back to focusing on business. But I don't think that Cal Makamoto, was poor at his job. That's my personal opinion. I think there were things that we could have engaged with him proactively and helped him be successful and not just stand back and throw darts. So I would love it if we could build that rapport with agencies to say we're partners, even as members of the minority party. Like, we don't want to see you fail. That's the last thing I want to do. Like, we're here telling you that we care about proper return on investment for tax dollars. So why would I then, sabotage an agency to not be able to deliver? That's a disconnect for me. So that's something we would love to see agencies, well-funded and effective. But I will say, we also don't want to see them. I said this the other day, the governor has doubled down on a lot of bad ideas. And her agencies have promulgated 500 new rules. She talked about it today, and she said, some of that's necessity because when you stand up new programs or whatever, you have to put in rules. Okay, but some of these rules are legislating through rulemaking process. OSHA's rules on ag housing is disastrous for my community. It will drive farmers out of business. It will make workers homeless. How do you justify that? Like, how do you make housing standards for agriculture more stringent than a hotel or a motel or you would for a landlord? Like, literally, some of these rules are beyond the pale and will have a very negative effect on our ability to produce food. The project labor agreement, executive order, we considered as the legislature and labor and business, we considered whether or not we should put forward that rule. We rejected it. You know who came forward and was the loudest voice in opposition? Minority and women-owned businesses. You know who the governor just told you she did it on behalf of? The very people that don't want it. She just alienated 70 to 80% of the entire population of contractors in Oregon. She suggested today that she thought not only would it hold costs, but it might reduce costs. And she said, I'm not aware of anything. It took me about 30 seconds to Google and look up a report that independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan research group has put together that shows, a 12 to 20% increase for housing production or for school construction. And road construction shows about 20 to 30%. We have an example within the state of a 22% increase to a project because of this type of agreement. So, when it comes to accountability, the legislature should stand up to that, in my opinion. We should stand up and say, wait a second, executive branch, you've reached beyond your authority, and we're going to take it back. We debated that, we considered it, we rejected it. The state of California, I thought it was interesting, Gavin Newsom points to too much costs when he rejected project labor agreements, said this is going to result in additional cost pressures that weren't accounted for in the budget. So, to suggest that it's going to hold costs or cut costs, I think is, again, it's a little too much for me.
We are almost out of time. Will you do one more from Christina?
Sure. You going to be down here every day?
No, actually.
No? I know. I
I'm
just
gonna be
met.
talking to-
I know. You're going to miss the commute?
I'll be here a little bit.
Okay.
So you guys talked about, fostering better goodwill amongst each other. We didn't necessarily see that same sort of spirit from your counterparts in the House. What are some of the major issues that you think there's going to be big disagreement on? And what are you doing to start having those negotiations early instead of at the end of the session when you're going to be stalling all these other bills that are going to pass through and having closed door negotiations like we saw in 2023 if we don't look at these issues now and start those negotiations early?
I mean, I'll say, I'm still processing the bill stack right now. I mean, I think sometimes people think that the legislature is this divinely constructed thing where we're coming in and we know everything that's going to happen. I mean, kind of the beauty of public policymaking in some sense is we come down here and there's kind of an orchestrated chaos to it, which I enjoy. I like the give and take around it, but I don't think outside of the things that we've identified are the big rocks that I think, and there will be a lot of negotiation, conversation, I'm sure, around transportation. We've talked about Medicaid. We know the budget's going to be a different animal this cycle. I think people are expecting that there's still this kind of overlay of federal money that's washing through, and I think it's going to get real that when we start actually putting numbers out there in a framework that we can't be everything to everyone all the time on that. I think those are the things. And then when it surfaces, sometimes you kind of don't even know what the thing is that's really going to be triggering. For me, what I've said is it's more than I need to be able to effectively go and when there's a conversation that's happening, I know Senator Jama feels the same way, that we want to be out ahead of it and not waiting for it. So if there's something that's already happening, I want to be already engaging in the conversation where I'm like, hey, I've got this caucus member that's saying this, or hey, did you hear this is happening over here? So I think more than anything, it's a little bit form over function for me too. I just need to make sure that rather than we're kind of saying, here's the thing or that's the thing, that we're making sure that we're really just at the table and communicating about everything and understanding what the full landscape is. So I don't see that there's, what is the thing that's going to blow it all up? I don't see that there's something out there. I'm going to give you the honest on it. I think that there's an opportunity for us to come together, focus on the big rocks, try to get the work that Oregonians have sent us here to do.
I think I want to add to that quickly. The reality is that part of the work that we do is just disagreement is just natural. We sometimes disagree. That's just not a question. I think the question is that how do we address it when there's a disagreement? And that's really for us what we are committing at this is that we want to make sure that every voice matter, regardless of where they are representing, what area, district that they're representing. So that's number one. Number two, we have done this work before. I think the last session, if you remember, we had a housing package that provided infrastructure funding for local jurisdictions across the state and statewide. And we did that through bipartisan collaboration, both House and the Senate, and both Republican and Democrats. We came to the table, we engaged with each other, and we were able to really build a package that works all Oregonians and fund this infrastructure support for across the state. That's kind of how the work that we are hoping to do this coming session, and collaboration is going to be big time. And I think good ideas comes from all directions. So we have to make sure open-mindedness and collaboration efforts has to be based off the building relationships with each other and being genuine with each other, but also ensuring that we create the space for it. That type of collaboration. That's what I'm going to commit to it, and I'm hoping that our colleagues also will commit to that process as well.
One of the things I've been waiting for that came out today, that was kind of fun. Ms. Cronin, who's new to the Democrat caucus comms division, I had her father as a math teacher in junior high school and in high school. Shout out to Dan Cronin and the excellent work he did. I know how to do math still to this day. But to have an agenda, laid out to get to see what the goals and the missions are. I heard what Senator Jama said, who, by the way, is just an absolutely likable man. Can we all agree? He's like one of the nicest people in this building. Dick Anderson said, wonderful times working with him on the housing project, pragmatic, focused on trying to solve a problem. If that's the approach, we're there. What we didn't hear about during the campaign season, what we didn't see until today, kind of hidden in their agenda, are some of the social things that I don't think we need to talk about. I think they're resolved. And I don't think we need to push the envelope on some of those things. I think we need to be responsive to Oregonians who are saying, wow, life's very expensive. I lack opportunity to get into a house. I do want to be safer. But I think for the most part, when I've talked to people about that, they're talking about the drug addiction that they see on the street. They're talking about the homelessness they see on the street. They're talking about the property crimes they see. They're not necessarily talking about enhanced gun laws that restrict Second Amendment rights. You'll notice we frame that very differently when we talk about it.
Safety for our communities.
Sensible.
But in terms of the transportation package, which seems to be the big element, in the room, the elephant in the room, you guys are going to have disagreements about how that's passed. Are you starting those conversations early? Are you committed to starting those conversations early about what that's going to look like so we don't end up at end of session with
Well, first and foremost, I want to know how serious it is. I think the governor gave more time to her high school track career than she did to talking about a transportation package in her speech. It feels like we might be getting serious about it with this February 14th prediction of a new bill. Again, I would love some support on getting access to what the framework is that we're already using as the fundamental premise to construct that bill. So, the sooner we can get to real tangible information, the sooner we can answer your question about how close
holding it
are
up?
we. I'm not aware.
Well, I will say the first committee hearing, welcome to the 83rd Legislative Assembly, is next Tuesday night at 5 o'clock, where there'll be an overview of the maps. ODOT's got some stuff scheduled. We've been working this. We kind of know what the inputs and the outputs are going to be for a transportation package. We know that we've got to look at this stuff differently.
Which is part of the reason why I push back on the statewide tour, right? We tout that we went to 12 different cities and we asked the people, but we didn't tell them anything. And so now we're going to come down here and cram into a 5-month session give them 30 seconds to 90 seconds to testify and tell us what they need us to know about a transportation package. This is a challenge. And so the sooner we get to what the there is, the sooner we can get real about whether or not we can find common ground.
And, so much of the work that happens is in committee on this. I mean, I think you have Gorsuch and McLean, you have Bruce Starr coming back into the building, and he brings a rich experience having been around a bipartisan transportation package in 2007. So I think that we've got good people that are committed, that are wanting to bring good ideas forward. I think we'll get there.
I think the process matters, and I think that's really what we're going to go through. President Wagner said that, going through the process of making sure tables be set up, I think, and then making sure that everybody comes to the table with their ideas and ensuring that we have that process of the system kicking off and making sure that there is a end product at the end of the day. I think ultimately the goal is like, how do we make sure that our transportation package is increasing prosperity for all Glorianis and making sure that there is economic benefits coming from that while we're also building the system itself. So I think for me it's about process and then outcomes and accountability also.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks to the Corps.